increases the risk of like another global pandemic. So to me, I guess I focus on like the anthro impacts rather than the bio impacts.
Okay.
That's kind of the perspective there.
Okay, so just to clarify, because we just went live on mine, on my stream, so just to clarify for everyone who's just joined, I am sat here with Socialism Done Left. Welcome, by the way, to the channel. And yeah, really great to have a conversation with them. I've watched some of your content before, not very much, mind you. Like obviously, I never get a chance to watch anything except now and again when I'm up at 4 o'clock in the morning watching Netflix when I really should just go to sleep. Apart from that, but yeah, like really happy to have a conversation. And he's just clarified that he's a vegan for anthropocentric reasons. So he's arguing it from an anthropocentric position. Now I'm going to say that you're not vegan. I'm going to say that you're plant based, and I'm going to gatekeep the hell out of that.
Okay.
And yeah, so do you want us to just get straight into it? Or?
Well, I guess one thing I usually do is I just ask people, like, why don't you tell us who you are, what you do, and where people can find you? So shill yourself real quick.
Okay, yeah. And obviously, I think you should do the same. Obviously, you probably, most of the people watching this probably know who you are already. But yeah, my name is Lewis Howarth. I am Perspective Philosophy on YouTube. You can check me out in the descriptions, channels in the description. I think it is anyway. And yeah, I'm 26 years old. I almost said 25. 26 years old, and I'm studying my PhD in philosophy, and I'm writing my thesis on animal liberation, a dialectical defense of animal liberation. So I'm taking a Hegelian stance, arguing that we should consider animals as equally within our moral spheres. The only other thing I would say that's relevant is I'm also a socialist, and for the same reasons that I'm a vegan.
I mean, so that's all like an interesting background. So I guess one thing I should do as a caveat is I am by no means a philosopher. Like most of the reading that I've done into stuff about like philosophy has been related to epistemology. So I haven't done like a very in-depth reading into like moral realism or stuff like that. So mostly it's just arguments I've picked up over time. But I'd be happy to talk about it, and perhaps you can change my view on it.
Yeah. So I guess like what I want to know is why. Yeah, I understand why you're coming from it on an anthropocentric level. I even say like, look, people should be plant-based and stuff on anthropocentric reasons alone. I think that's very sound. I even did a video on worker exploitation in relation to slaughterhouse workers, titled "Working in Hell," because of basically most of them, very many of them, come from low-class backgrounds. A lot of the time they're immigrants, so like economic immigrants, and they're forced into these jobs because of economic coercion. When they enter these jobs, they are placed into conditions that are comparable to warfare, if not worse, because there's no higher meaning usually associated with the job. They are actively condemned by society, and many of them develop what's called perpetration-induced traumatic stress. That has been tied to it's actually a worse form of PTSD, depending on obviously the PTSD that people get, in which you get PTSD from actually perpetrating violence.
Yeah.
It leads to a form of psychological disassociation and alienation that is so severe that individuals turn to alcoholism and drug addiction just to get through the days. High suicide rates, domestic violence and crime rates are directly associated with the size of a slaughterhouse facility in the location. Many of these facilities are placed in low-income areas, low-income black areas, for example, in the United States, have waste runoff that pollutes local water supplies and air supplies, actively leading to cancers and other horrible conditions, and increased risk of zoonotic diseases, as you said, obviously global pandemics. So yeah, even on basic anthropocentric,
even on the local level, I just interject a bit. There was literally a study when I was doing a course in undergrad chemistry, which correlated the amount of feces from like a local farm with like the rate of antibiotic resistant bacteria in the air. They weren't able to link it. They didn't have data on like the health of humans, but like there's a direct correlation between like certain types of animal agriculture and the creation of antibiotic resistance bacteria. It's not even at a global level, just like even on a local level, it's fucking people over.
Oh, absolutely.
So yeah, I would agree.
And even with antibiotic resistance, the biggest form, it's actually the biggest cause of antibiotic resistance. So yeah, this is usually, I mean, obviously you get it with obviously the in relation to the air and like them actually pumping feces into the air, which is just disgusting. But it's they're actually feeding animals antibiotics because of the conditions they're in. So they're fed so many antibiotics, and these are the same antibiotics that we get fed, by the way. So what happens is,
Yeah, because there's only like,
yeah,
I think it's like 12 antibiotics. It's actually a pretty limited class. So when we feed them, we're feeding the same things that we'd feed ourselves most of the time.
yeah.
So
So it's just it's just an existential threat to humanity. So like even on an anthropocentric level, I can understand why you would reject it. However, what I would say is it's kind of morally lucky. Like if you were to say like the difference between a vegan and a non-vegan, I would say really is that a vegan will always consider animals as being animal exploitation is wrong. And it's a sentient disposition, so we value sentient creatures. Now, that's written in basically to the vegan society definition. So, like, I think the vegan society definition is a vegan diet. Veganism is a philosophy and way of life which seeks to exclude as far as possible and practicable all forms of exploitation to and cruelty of animals for food, pleasure, and blah blah blah. Essentially, and then it says for the benefit of animals, humans, and the environment. The whole point is that like I would say that the environment is only valuable in relation to a sentient being. Humans are only valuable because they are sentient beings, and animals are also sentient beings. Now, I can ground my ethics objectively in relation to sentience and the functional concept and the valuation of life itself. I would say that ultimately animals share the same value in their lives as we do, that they are valuable in and of themselves without us, having to give them value, that humans have the same value. And this is why we would reject things like racism, like race as a presupposed value, tribalism, like, nationality as a presupposed value, sex as a presupposed value, class as a value. And ultimately, value only correlates to the experiences that an individual can have of value and that individual who experiences them. So like value implies an evaluator. And I would say that the evaluator is what we consider in ethics. So what I want to know is why you would think it would ever be justified in not considering an animal.
Sure. So I guess the two kind of thoughts here. One is so I've had talks with people who speak about this in general. If just as a hypothetical to see what your response would be, if hypothetically we were able to like genetically modify, for example, cattle to be unsentient, like they're literally just living flesh bags, for whatever definition of sentient you're willing to work with, would you then be willing with animal agriculture of said like brain dead cattle?
Well, I think it would be the same for humans then, so I wouldn't care.
Well, yeah, no, I'm just saying like,
yeah,
is the argument that like, yeah, then we'd be okay with it?
Yeah, I mean, like if you're saying like if you had meat trees, yeah, that's fine. Like,
Okay,
it's just it's the same. It's just essentially the same as culture, like what is it, like meat cultures and stuff.
Yeah, so I don't have a disagreement with there, except for ecological, I guess, impacts. But like assuming that it's just a meat tree, as you say, then no big deal. We just got now, instead of underpaid workers in the meat plant factory, they're just underpaid workers in like the meat groves picking out meatballs.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So I guess then the reason that I would basically give is this gets into like a very deep moral discussion, and so I'm sure we're going to get through there eventually. The basic problem I have with like using sentience as a moral value is twofold. One is that it seems like a very binary way to approach whether something has moral value or it doesn't. Like because then there's this question of on the one end, is there a point at which something is not sentient and therefore doesn't have value? And when would we determine that? Like, how do we determine that? And the other end, there's this question of, can there be a being that is ever sufficiently intelligent that harming it would be more harmful, be more morally wrong than harming another being? So the question basically becomes then, are all sentient lives equally important, or is there a weighting? Because in a binary view, if it's sentient or non-sentient, they are all equally weighted once they've hit that sentient threshold. So I guess then the question would be like, where's the threshold, and is everything equal after it?
Yeah, so I would say the threshold was conscious evaluation of one's experience. I would say that's because the individual wouldn't have any way of experiencing like good or bad, harm or well-being, or positive or negative at all. And so ethics are unrelated to them. The whole point of ethics is in relation to achieving the good life. And plants can't have good lives because they're not conscious beings. They're not able to have an experience of value. And so axiologically, I would say that there is no actual like value to be found in plants in and of themselves, beyond their value, beyond how they're valued in relation to sentient creatures which experience value in relation to them as habitats, as as producers of their food and so on like that. I would say that the reason that the reason I would reject a sentience hierarchy, and this is a
Hmm.
a notion perpetuated by some vegans. Like, ask yourself, it
Hmm.
perpetuates this. I think Vegan Gains perpetuates this. There's a few misinformed vegans, I would say, that perpetuate this, and I don't think that it's something that's unreasonable. But I think that in the sense that I understand why they do it, because they think that the more
Hmm.
complex an individual's experience is, the more valuable that experience is. Now, there's two ways I would like to approach this. One, I would like to point out that the individual doesn't experience value in relation to their intelligence. It modifies it modifies their experience. So what you have is,
Hmm.
you can have what's in terms of phenomenology, you can have what's called a ready to hand and a present at hand experience. This is a Heideggerian term in relation to what he talks about in being in time. A ready to hand experience is essentially the moment you're in, right? It's like the experience of the here and now, right? The present, right? The present at hand experience is your evaluation of the here and now. So it creates essentially a separation. This would be like identity and self-awareness, self-consciousness, right?
Hmm.
Now, what I would say is that that self-awareness creates new values. Like you get an understanding of yourself through time. So someone could go, "I'm going to kill you tomorrow," and then you would feel fear in relation to the threat that you may die tomorrow. And that would be
Hmm.
impossible to experience if you were in a ready to hand experience. Now, I would say that ready to hand experience is animals. So if I said to an animal, I am going to kill you tomorrow, they
Hmm.
wouldn't have the conceptual, even if we managed to somehow
Yeah, granting that we
yeah,
somehow were able to communicate it.
yeah, they wouldn't have the conceptual basis to hold that constant to make sure that they actually understood. Now, I would say that ultimately that changes like how you can, morally and ethically deal with them, but that doesn't change the value. At the end of the day, the value of their experience when you do kill them is the same. If you were to torture them, it would be the same. But it also can lead to individuals escaping negative experiences. So this is why it's not just a pure negative; it can be a positive. If you are self-aware and you're a stoic, for example, you may go to a mental garden in your head and avoid the pains that you experience in life because of this ability to detach and disassociate. And disassociation in psychology is actually a self-defense mechanism which prevents you from
Hmm.
experiencing too much harm in this ready-to-hand experience. So when we say that, like, could a being with adequate intelligence be worth or valuable more because of their intelligence? I'd absolutely reject that. One, people who are mentally disabled aren't worth less than people who aren't mentally disabled. Even if if they've got lower IQs or lower, mental capacities, that doesn't mean that they experience more or less in their lives, and whether they value that experience more or less. The valuation of the experience comes from them being an experiencer, from them being an evaluator. And that's what we consider. We don't consider the content of their experience anyway, because we don't have access to it. The reality is, a cow might experience pain and pleasure 1,000 times greater than a human, or 100 times less than a human. But because of the hard problem of consciousness, I can't access the conscious state of that cow anyway. Just like I can't access your mind. The only thing that is communicated is like resistance of approval and dismissal. So like, I understand that being that is suffering and resisting, therefore I know that it's experiencing negative. To what degree depends upon the resistance, and I use a standard in relation to all sentient beings in relation to myself, because that's the only standard that I can kind of go off. And trying to say that, like, look, if something's more or less intelligent, it's experiencing better or worse, is nonsense, because we don't know what the value of that experience is to that sentient being anyway. So I would absolutely dismiss the sentience hierarchy. I think it's misguided, and I think that ultimately it relies on speciesism.
So I guess the basic problem that I have with this perception. So let's say that first we like grant, which I think there's some reasonableness here, that there's a total separation between like the sensations, the what you call the ready at hand experience, like the what a being is currently going through, and that is totally separate. And that's not actually what we're interested in morally evaluating. To some degree, we're more interested in evaluating the ability to evaluate. If to me it seems like this one very clearly differs between like as like individuals and species, like as you yourself were saying, an animal is unable to consider to evaluate the future, and so like like let me do like a very crude utilitarian calculus here. Let's imagine that it were the case that like one being, say humans, were like 2 times more capable of evaluating the future than were like another animal, and that greater evaluation in turn didn't just lead to them having like greater moral value, but it also led to them having greater, say, ability to improve the future. It could be possible that by sacrificing or in other words harming some of the like lower animal, of the less evaluable animal, that actually all of them would be better off in the future because we gave more power, more like control to the higher evaluatory being. So I guess I'm just like, this is like a hyper crude utilitarian calculus, but from the moral logic that you've set out, does this not follow? If the goal is simply to like allow that like many beings have the ability to evaluate, if, for example, I guess the basic way to imagine this is like there are many more cows that there are today than there were ever in history. If we were to imagine hypothetically human expand throughout like the galaxy, make everything living or whatever, and now there's billions and billions of animals all suffering, would that not be like an increase of evaluation? How are we to measure these sorts of things?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think you've just showed like obviously like the perpetuation of humans isn't necessarily good if the humans are unethical, right? Like if we were to like have obviously if everyone became a Nazi and then we had like Nazis, you know, perpetuating themselves throughout the universe in some sort of Nazi space empire and when you know exploiting, you know, I don't know, someone in the Gamma Quadrant or something, you know, that wouldn't be a good thing. Like obviously the ethics of the individuals who are being given power are what matter. And I would say that, look, we need to separate what is ethical agency and ethical patienthood. Agency is our ability to engage and act in accordance with reasons, our ability to understand what is valuable and act in accordance with value. Patienthood is the ability to experience value. Now, if I was to say that, look, it might very well be the case that in valuing humans more, we create a better experience for animals. I'd say, like, one, this is normative. It doesn't mean the animal was worth less anyway. It means my responsibility to a given animal was modified by the totality of animals, like animal simpliciter. So my responsibility to sentient beings would be modified by my responsibility to as an individual in relation to a given sentient being. So I could argue, look, I have a greater responsibility for my mother than like somebody else's mother, in order to maximize the outcome. Now, I'm not actually a consequentialist. Well, I am kind of. I'm not a utilitarian. I'm a Hegelian, so that's more of like a mixture of, it's closer to threshold deontology. It's a mixture of consequentialism and deontology. So I would say that we act in accordance with reason because reason exists in community, in institution, between individuals, and not in the mind and caprice of a given individual who, like, I don't know if you know many people who make maths mistakes even. Maths is just pure logic, pretty much. And yet we still make mistakes on pure logic. Now, that's just an error in reasoning. What we need is other people, in terms of, especially when it's epistemics, other people to verify and falsify our positions in order to have true justified belief. And so I would say that knowledge and reasons can only exist in community. And so I would say that the perpetuation of a deontological structure will always reflect the best consequence, and that the understanding of the consequences can only be determined by this interlocutors communicating and agreeing with each other or dismissing each other. And even on a
go ahead.
I was just going to say, even on a fundamental level, our understanding of each other and our personal values, our very psychology in its development, our understanding of self-awareness exists once we accept other people as being able to dismiss and verify ourselves and our desires. And so ultimately, if we try to perpetuate something which is egoistical and private, we are going to lead on a path of self-destruction. At least we are as likely to lead down a path of self-destruction, which is why you see people who are like this, like fragile narcissists, typically end up homeless.
So I guess then to me, these naturally seem to extend to ideas again that like there might be differences in how much we value these sorts of things. If like we are only able to find like a true self, like a sense of selfness, right, through a sense of community, then it seems very reasonable to think that there are certain beings which are more able to access that self, that community, and therefore we're able to access like the idea of the self. If the only thing that we're interested in here is preserving like the beings which can have possibly that like idea of the self, then there also I think would be I think that view would be way too simplistic. If the goal is instead to actually achieve this sort of like perception of the self as opposed to the other, if the goal is actually achieve these sorts of things, then again you'd actually want to maximize the beings which are most able of actually getting through to that. Like I guess the basic way that I come at these things, so I would call myself more of a rule utilitarian. Utilitarianism not being like happiness here, but in general, I think that the role of like moral agents should be, broadly speaking, I think that we don't have good reason to believe that any of our moral systems are real at the current moment. So if you wish to act morally, your moral obligation as a moral actor should be to, one, try and increase the total knowledge of like sentient beings, of like sapient beings, and to increase, two, the ability of those sapient beings to act on the world. And so the problem that I have is I feel like the view that you're proposing here is simply that we should maximize simply beings which have the possibility of like that they are agents, but not necessarily that they are like agents which are able to fully comprehend or use their agency. Whereas I think that I'm literally trying to maximize like the ability of agents to exercise their agency in the maximum possible way. And to some degree, that does mean that some agents are more able to exercise that than others. And so to some degree, you would be acceptable, you would be okay with like causing the harm of some to benefit the others, so long as the others were many, many more times in scale.
See, what I would say is that, like, what you're differing there is like, one, I wouldn't say that like animals are agents. I'd just say them as patients. But I would say like, look, like even if we agree that rationality is a valuable extrinsically in relation to the production of moral goods, then the value of rationality is in relation to the rational agent reflecting what is right and good in the first place, and that is metaphysically separate from the rationality. Like reason itself being good because it produces good outcomes is separate from reason in itself being good. And so if what is rational is in respect to what is good and what is valuable, then if that good and value lies on the side of all experience, then the perpetuation of more rational beings is only itself possible if we are respecting all value in and of itself. Now, if you say that like this in a normative sense, like if you see this
just from a consequentialist perspective, why is this necessarily the case, right? Like the idea of respect from a deontological perspective also always has these like universalized ideas. Like we are respecting literally every animal, but why is it not possible that we could very easily imagine a world where like animal testing? Let's imagine that animal testing were effective, and I haven't read anything to literature there, so I have no idea if it is. Let's just imagine that it were true, that it actually is, right?
Yeah.
Just for the ethical argument. So then the argument would be, hey, the suffering of some, right? Let's say that we're causing the suffering of like 1 in a million beings could improve the well-being of the other 999,999 sort of thing. So I guess the question becomes like, why is respect to this universalized principle rather than something that we simply maximize or do not?
Well, I would say that utilitarianism. Yeah. So I'd say that utilitarianism usually makes the mistake of positing an abstract which has no grounding. So I would say like, what is good and bad without the relation to an experience of good and bad, and the value of that experience is grounded in actions of individuals. Like the reason that people enter ethics in the first place is to maximize their subjectivity. And so when we're talking about individuals trying to maximize their subjectivity, we'll start from an individualistic perspective and build upwards rather than a universal perspective and build downwards. I think that when we try and take the position of a God's eye view, what we lose is the essential evaluation of the world which it is built upon in the first place. And so I would say that the abstract needs to be a genus of an individual, and I would take an Aristotelian position on this, that there has to be an irreducible value in relation to the world which we can understand, rather than some sort of abstract notion of good which is presupposed and left to the caprice of the agent and would usually fail to something like
it seems like you are objectively suggesting that like at a universal level that we should not be harming agents. Like we should not be harming patients, right?
If we can avoid that, yeah. Like I would say that the universal, but hermeneutic. So an understanding of a universal is like built on a genus, not an abstract. So like the difference is like, it's like whether you start at the top and work down or whether you start at the bottom and work up. I'm saying that we have to start at the bottom and work up. And so the understanding of the universal is comprised of individual.
Sure, but why would this be the case, right? Like why would it necessarily be the case that we should only value individuals, we should only value patients because we worked up from there? Like why is it that abstracts would be incapable of doing this, but like working from the bottom up would be capable? Like I guess I'm generally pretty skeptical of like a lot of moral realist theories. That's why I'm coming at this from like more of a moral skeptical sort of view. So the question is like, why is it any more valid to work up from the individual and say, hey, this individual has the ability to perceive the world, therefore we should care that they perceive the world, than it is to work downwards and say, hey, we value the ability to perceive the world, we're going to maximize agents. Why is one better than the other?
Okay, so one has found in the sense that you can actually defeat Hume's guillotine. Well, like I say defeat, I say like essentially Do you know Hume's law, Hume's guillotine?
I do not. Why don't you
So
summarize it for the benefit of the chat?
yeah. Like so, you cannot derive an ought from an is. Simply
Hmm.
enough. Like so, the idea of Hume's law is essentially anything which proposes that you can create, let's say, trees are green, and then the
Hmm.
next premise is therefore we should cut them down. It's like you are, or like we ought to cut them down because trees are green, or something like that. You would be.
Sure. I mean, how would you get around the is-ought gap just by starting from the
Yeah.
individual?
So what I would say is that you relate it to functional concepts. This is explained really well in Alistair McIntyre's book After Virtue, the first few chapters, essentially where he dismisses subjectivism. So fundamentally, Hume's gap, like the years-old gap, is built upon an understanding that you cannot derive an ought from an is because they are two separate. They are two separate statements. An is statement relates to the ontology of a being descriptively, and an ought statement relates to the ontology of a being prescriptively. Ontology, for anyone who doesn't know, is the study of being. Okay.
Mhm.
But what Alistair McIntyre shows is that some beings, because of what they are, because of the descriptive aspect of them, can only be described in relation to a function. That function has an end in its relation. So like an animal, for example, could only be or a human, for example, could only be described in its in its desires, in the fact that it tries to engage in the world, that it is seeking a certain goal. It's like when we describe the difference between, let's say, mammals, plants, and like fish, birds, and so on. What we do is we relate it to the functions and the behaviors of those animals, because primarily they are seeking different goals in relation to their life. If we take it from that perspective, that is a descriptive statement which includes an embedded ought statement. Some people call this, there's also like arguments in terms of metaphysics, and it's called supervening, in which there is a supervened ought statement. So like, because it's a bird, it needs to eat this food, or because it's like lions need to eat meat,
But
it's a
isn't this
carnivore.
fundamentally just a conditional ought, right? It's like if the bird wishes to live, then it must eat food. Why would it be the case that simply because an object has a function that it ought to perform that function? Like, let's imagine for a moment that I had genetically engineered the biomass killing machine, right? It's like I'd taken like Hitler and I don't know, some other mass murderer, Anders Bering Breivik, right? I'd fused their DNA together and I'd made this like big ball of like biomass that's going around killing things. Just because its function is to kill, why should we care about it fulfilling that function? Why is that function innately moral?
Well, one, it's because I would say that the conscious awareness of that function is the evaluation of that function, and the evaluation of that function is the experience of value, which is irreducible. I would say that, like, it's not that we should care, it's that we cannot deny the experience of positive and negative that exists within us. Even at the end
I
of
don't think we're
Cartesian.
denying it, right? I'm just saying that some oughts, some things that some animals want to do, I don't think are morally useful.
But only
Like in
but what's the
nature,
standard?
humans
But
rape,
then,
right? Why do I care that humans have that function?
yeah,
Shouldn't I
but
want to override that function?
100%. Like, if look, like the only way you can evaluate the function, though, is in relation to understanding what is valuable in the first place. So like, evaluating the function is in relation to the expression of the subjectivity of the being. So like, that individual has its subjectivity, and so its function has moral weight to it. The pain and pleasure, the positive and negative experience of that being, which is irreducible to that being. And I would then say the understanding of value can then only be understood in a universal. So we take that irreducible, like, this is like, some people debate this depending on whether you're going to talk about your understanding of Aristotle. But there is Aristotle understood in relation to particulars, and then there's Aristotle understood in relation to universals. I would say that Aristotle only makes sense if we understand that the individual, the actual, like, individual animal, the individual aspect of whatever being it is, with the function and various causes which metaphysically create this being, is only possible if we apply universal concepts to it. It's like, if I talk about my given experience, I'm saying, like, this is a laptop in front of me. I don't, and a laptop is what it is because it is shared in the experience of other individuals. And it must relate to that experience of other individuals to have meaning, because language works only when we communicate with other individuals. So essentially, because we are communicating and because we have a common experience, we can understand aspects of our experience divested from other aspects. I know that this is a laptop and that a laptop is separate from a sofa or a camera, and so on.
It's clarify if I'm incorrect, but it seems like at first you were suggesting that like all moral theories have to start from the individual and then work upwards. But now it seems like you're talking about how like having to have universal ideas that could apply to all individuals, and like the semantics that we derive from being in a community, and this is like the only way we can perceive these sort of objects. It doesn't seem like it's rising up from the individual anymore. It seems like it's about like how we as like a community perceive individuals.
Well, this is the thing. I would say that individuals are the foundation of universals. So like and this is what Aristotle takes it to be as well, like a genus is created by, you know, a variety of different experiences of laptops. For example, the concept of a laptop is built up of the experience of laptops in from which we all share. And we can construct this universal by communicating these aspects of our experience, refining it, and then, you know, create an idea or a concept which can be communicated in language, namely that of being a laptop. Now, I would say that,
I guess how does that actually get back to like caring about what the function of a being is, right? Like, let's say that we've now like gotten what the function of a laptop is. Why do I care about the function of a laptop?
Okay, so if we, like the thing is with the function of a laptop, I would say like, look, the function of a laptop is it has no inherent function, right, in and of itself, no natural function. So its function is only in relation to a being which gives it function. It's a tool. And then I would say like, look, so then there has to be, you know, a metaphysically prior function to that. And if we look back, we'll go, all right, so like the function of a human, for example, is to use the laptop. And it's like, right, but why does any of this we consider
the human function is worthwhile, right?
Yeah,
the conscious being can impose a function onto like beings which don't have a function. So basically the conscious being has a function which we assume to be morally valuable, and then we apply it on a non like conscious being. So like I understand we're getting back to the conscious one. Why does the conscious one's function matter?
Yeah, I would say that the individual that experiences that value cannot help but evaluate it. It's irreducible. It's experiential. It's not that they
sure, but why do we care about people's experiences, right? Like this is what I'm trying to get at is like, why does the mere fact that we perceive mean that perception is morally worthwhile? What is the link between perception, which I consider to be a literally prescriptive, descriptive statement about the world, to like a normative or ethical statement about like, hey, because we perceive something, therefore we should do something.
Okay, yeah. So like the whole point of ethics is to engage in it's pertaining, ethikos, pertaining to behavior. And ultimately, it's about refining our behaviors in such a way to achieve the good life. The whole thing that in relation to the being which is actually engaged in ethics is that they already care about their own experiences by nature, and therefore seek to create an experience which is of the greatest likelihood to produce a good life. Now, to do so, they need to remove themselves of subjective bias, which means that they need to remove caprice and understandings of reality which are generated from, a private understanding. Instead, they seek to separate and understand themselves from an outside position. So, for example, an individual who wants to take drugs may very well feel like, in terms of first order desires, that they would benefit from taking drugs. They feel like it would be good, it's desirable, they want to feel the pleasure. Yet, if they evaluate themselves from an objective standpoint, they can understand that this isn't in their interests. And so what I would say ethics gives us is the separation of first order and second order desires. First order desires being what you want in the moment, your preferences. Second order desires being your interests, what is actually good for you. I'd say that's only possible if we generate universals, and those universals have to pertain to, axiologically, to value which is not inherent to a single agent, but inherent to a common property which is understandable by everyone. Otherwise, it would epistemologically be subjective.
Okay, so then if the argument here is just like, hey, an individual is egoistic, they want to achieve the maximal likelihood of the good life for themselves, and therefore we work up from that, and that's like the moral foundation. Maybe this is the argument for like why we need to start from the individual. I'm not sure why this wouldn't cleanly arrive at like a utilitarian approach, right? You talked about the second order approach to this, right? If the idea is that the individual's desires are not innately moral, but that there can be something which is actually good for you, why would it be the case that we have to care about an individual's perceptions to know what is genuinely good for them? Like, I guess the example I would point to is generally humans seem to think that it is okay to ignore some children's desires because you want to like force them to eat veggies, you want to force them to go to school, you like force them to do things which ultimately give them a better life. We are generally okay okay with parents coercing children to like raise them in a way where ultimately the children will be more autonomous. So why doesn't this lead to like a world more akin to like utilitarianism versus a view of like radical autonomy for the individual or radical valuing of the individual?
Yeah, so what I would say is that if utilitarianism wasn't grounding it in the experience of the individual, then I would ask them what they were evaluating in the first place. When we talk about the value of like trying to feed kids veggies, what we are talking about is the interests of that child in relation to their experiences throughout life. We understand that if we just let them eat sweets, their teeth will rot and ultimately they'll feel the pain of having to have them removed. We know that they'll feel experiences that they are undesirable to them, and so they wish to avoid them. They just don't know that they wish to avoid them. And so their individual reasoning is what is called into question. They don't understand what's good for them. They're patients, they're not agents. And it's exactly the same for animals. It's exactly the same for people who try to act irrationally. Ultimately, we judge this against the value of their interests. And I would say that an individual understands their interests in relation to their desires, for one, like the expression of their desires, creating a positive and negative experience. We understand that an understanding of desire metaphysically, that desire itself can be harmful, that if we let our desires run away with us, that we can even personally become addicted and in pain and seek to relinquish the desire, not to feel pleasure, but simply not to feel the pain of the desire anymore. And this is only possible in a second order theory, which takes an individual as valuable in and of themselves, and then expounds it out to understanding that all individuals are valuable in and of themselves. And
so
yeah,
so I guess so. Two thoughts here. The first is if the idea here is simply that individuals might not realize that like their immediate desires are not the same thing as their like second order actual like goals, what is actually good for them. I don't think that necessarily leads to the conclusion that all individuals are worthwhile, unless you believe that all desires or all actually goods are like decided by the individual. Like again, it could be very easy to imagine that we set up we do the moral scenarios all the time. If there's 1,000 individuals and the aliens say, hey, give us 10 of them, we'll eat them and we won't kill the other 990 of you. It seems very easy to say that like the average individual would be substantially better off were we to do something like this. Do you take that sort of like bet? Do you accept those sorts of bargains? Or do you say that every individual is so valuable that harming any individual is just unacceptable?
Well, I don't think you don't have to do that. Like in understanding that the individual is valuable in and of themselves, you can understand that the greater amount of individuals who are harmed is a greater perpetual harm. Like that is fine. And that's like,
but then this just seems like utilitarianism, right?
No,
it's literally just saying like, hey, we look at individuals and then we sum up a whole bunch of individuals, right? What's the difference?
I'd say that the difference is in relation, one, because it's bottom up, and so it actually is grounded. And two, utilitarianism understands. Well, it depends on the utilitarian you talk to, right? So like one of the utilitarians I was referencing earlier, I'm pretty sure is a utilitarian. I don't think he's utilitarian actually. He's Tom Regan, who was actually talking about like, do we value the evaluator or their experiences? Now, what he creates the distinction between patienthood and agency, right? And he talks about how we value the cup and not the contents, and the contents of the cup is valuable because it's an aspect of the cup. So like, if there was no cup, the experience wouldn't be there, right, to be evaluated. Now, basically what I'm saying is that because we are all trying to seek that which is the good life, a meaningful life, a purposeful life, and we all agree upon on a universal engagement with each other, which is comprised of everyone, then one, we are removing bias and understanding reality not in relation of some presupposed abstract right, which is coming from, let's say, like a Platonic or Kantian or utilitarian standpoint, which is usually wrong, which is why it fails to Hume's guillotine, which is why it allows for the perpetuation of racism, sexism, fascism, and other,
This just sounds like, so I'm going to be like, I don't understand this logic whatsoever. How do we get from the conclusion that like, hey, sometimes people's individual desires can be wrong, to the conclusion, like I asked you, what do we do about the aliens?
But how do you know that they're wrong? Like what is the measure of right and wrong in the first place if we don't have a grounded, irreducible relation to that? Are you just going to presuppose it?
Kind of what I'm asking is, what is that actual measure of right and wrong? Because if right and wrong is just what individuals want, then I assume you think that some individuals want things that are wrong.
No,
right?
Well, it's not just what individuals want. It's what is actually good and experientially good and
experientially good.
Well, I'd say
Yeah, but
that
how do we know?
we can only well, it's what's experienced by individuals. So if I understand that
If
individuals,
individuals experience things, then we just said that individuals can be wrong about what is good for them to experience, right?
Mhm.
So then is it their experiences are objectively good, or that we can know better than individuals?
it's the
Like
right,
which?
well, it's more of like we understand experience itself to be objectively good, and some experiences are good and bad for agents in relation to their nature, which we evaluate as being separate. So like it's what's in philosophy, it's what's called hermeneutics. When you go from the universal to the individual to the universal again, and it's a constantly evaluative process in which you understand a universal in relation to its application, which allows for reevaluation and reapplication. So it's a constantly moving process, which is why ethics is
Sure.
constantly
So why can't we
developing.
just do that for like a utilitarian thing? Let's just weight whatever we think utilitarianism
Because
is to whatever the
if we
average individual
because
thinks is good, or
it's
whatever
the
we think is actually good.
well, because it's like if I assume like if in have you ever heard of master slave ethics?
Like Nietzsche, I've heard of it. What about it?
So it's like Hegel was the one that first came up with it, right? So the whole point of what he says is that in relation to ethics, if I was to go like, look, what is good for me, and so I want you to do whatever I tell you to because you being my slave is good for me. He says that that is wrong for both the master and the slave, because essentially the power dynamics, the inability to objectively understand one another's interests and preferences or values in relation to each other, essentially presupposes or asserts a notion of what is justified without having a common metaphysical justification. So in other words,
Sure.
I need to understand what is good for us to understand what is good for me. And if I assume what is good for me and I presuppose that and I set that as the universal, then I don't understand what is good for us. That I don't
So
understand what's good for me.
I'm very willing to grant that like if we don't understand everyone's perspectives, this is like the basic idea of standpoint theory. We might be missing out on the truth and therefore might be evaluating things incorrectly. Is the suggestion here that you're extending like the master slave sort of idea that if there's any coercion, that it becomes impossible to know like what is genuinely best for everyone?
It's more of the fact that you cannot have knowledge without, not only just you cannot know, but you couldn't even understand what value was without an objective common standpoint. I would say that our identities
Sure,
are even
I'm trying to
understanding
get
of
at
self.
how would we know what this objective standpoint is, right? Because the master slave thing merely seems to suggest that under certain ideas of coercion, it becomes impossible to know what is genuinely good for both of us because we are so unable to understand, we are so not able to understand each other, right? But if the only idea here is that like we don't understand each other, what does understanding each other look like? How do we like? Let's say there's no masters, there's no slaves, everyone's equitable now. How do we know? We like all sit down. How do we know what's objectively good for all of us? What is the actual process that we do to arrive at that value?
Yeah, so I would say that we would, create rational and logically deduced arguments in relation to value itself and what we would say was commonly held as valuable, which would be the interests of all individuals. They know that
Isn't that just saying that that's what like that? Isn't that just saying that's what the average person wants, or what everyone as individuals
no,
wants?
it'd be more like saying this is what everyone must want because this is the vestitude of experiential value, which is the only thing that could be considered valuable by definition.
Sure, but then if it's fundamentally just a way of trying to aggregate individual people's preferences, how is this not different than like a certain type of preference utilitarianism?
Well, it's not about aggregating preferences. Obviously, it's in relation to, well, one, I think utilitarianism itself doesn't take an institutional standpoint and doesn't understand that our responsibilities are in relation to, our argumentation itself exists in community. It allows an individual to make judgments about reality in relation to a presupposed abstract right, which is the greatest amount of pain or pleasure from which they themselves understand. What I would say is that even our understanding, our basic comprehension of pain and pleasure has to be institutionalized and understood in that way before we can even engage with it. And I would say that the only way to really do this is if we create like deontological structures, like structures which allow us to behave and act within the world. We will actively engage with those structures, and when they fail, when we reach a point of tragedy in which people are suffering or the outcome wasn't what we expected or good in any way, then we reevaluate those structures and create new structures again, and that's hermeneutic.
So I guess to me, this reads very much like preference utilitarianism, but you want to include a really big clause that people's preferences don't count unless we can have these sort of structures, what you call deontological structures or institutions, which allow us to be reasonably certain that everyone's preferences are genuinely being taken into account. So it's just like preference utilitarianism plus like no oppression. To put it very
It's
simplistically.
it's not a preference utilitarian standpoint, because one, I would separate preferences from interests, and even someone like Peter Singer does that. The understanding that
But you just suggested that the way we derive what is an interest is by taking everyone's preferences and rationally deriving what is objectively good for everyone.
well,
So then, is it about people's preferences, or is it about like something that we can derive that is objectively good?
it's like
if so, then it's not preference; it's just utilitarianism.
well,
right?
it's like if we look at preferences, we can see that there is a common held property within preferences, which is, I would say, the expression of subjectivity in relation to achieving a good experience. I think that's rationally deducible in relation. All the end of all desire is something that which is desirable. What is desirable is of positive experience. What is of positive experience is beneficial, which will create the most like positivity throughout an individual's life. And so what we have is a first order desire and a second order desire. First order desires are the individual preferences. Second order desires are the understanding of the whole system of drives, the nature of the being.
Sure. So I guess the question that I'm trying to get at is, if the idea is simply that like we can collectively arrive at what is objectively good for individuals, why are we talking about their preferences in the first place? Like, if the only idea is that we need to ground what is objectively good by talking about their preferences, sure. But then eventually we will come to what is objectively good. And apparently it seems to be something like, hey, allowing people to have subjective experiences, which again, I feel like you could even put this as a form of utilitarianism. It's just maximizing freedom, maximizing autonomy.
Yeah, but it's maximizing freedom, but in a way that it's the whole point of an individual engagement in ethics is to express their own subjectivity in the first place. So if we reject that the individual's engagement in ethics was based upon the valuation of their experiences, then we have rejected an individual's desire to enter ethics in the first place, which means that it is irrelevant to the individual, that it's ungrounded. Because if they don't find themselves in the universal, their interests are not in that universal, then it is not relevant and pertaining to their life, in which case it's just abstract and ungrounded. This is essentially the criticism of Kant.
Sure, but like,
why would anyone do it?
If we're talking through like the steps that you just went through, right? Your suggestion was that we take everyone's preferences into account and rationally derive something which is objectively true for everyone. I don't think you can do that. If your main critique is that like, hey, this like objective value in preference utilitarianism or other utilitarianism isn't rationally derived, I would just say like, yeah, sure. I don't think that you can derive one thing that everyone values. I'm not sure that all agents value the same thing. That's the classic reason you bring up something like the analogy is to like the utility monster, right? It's the deontic monster. The deontic monster literally just wants to kill. That is the only subjective preference that it wants. And so like it is impossible to apply an objective standard in which like all the other agents want to live and the Hitler monster wants to kill, right? It is impossible to have an objective metric for all of these unless you don't care about some people's preferences.
Oh no, it's absolutely objective. So you could say that someone's that the value that they experience is objectively good in relation to that being, but that it's overall bad in relation to the expression of subjectivity. So like respecting given
but
groups,
then it's about maximizing subjectivity, right?
But the difference is that an individual finds them. This is why bottom up makes a difference, because the individual finds themselves in the universal. Because we care about subjectivity in the first place on an individual.
But this individual won't. Hitler monster won't find himself in the universal where we try to stop people from killing. He'll be like, "Why are you arresting me? I just want to kill. That is my subjective preference." Like, sorry, we're the anti-subjectivist police. We're locking you away.
The individual will find themselves in the universal because they will allow themselves to understand themselves in the first place to even come up with the understanding that they want to kill, because I would say that they don't understand their desires or preferences even without language which is existing between agents. And two,
do you really think it's not possible to create a being which genuinely only wants to kill? Like, I don't.
It would be what they want is in relation to what is knowable, and let's say like they couldn't know. Let's say what I would say is that you couldn't have an understanding of your individual preferences that are not based upon group engagement. And so, if your preference was to kill the group, then your understanding
that's
of
how
self
humans work, right? But I'm trying to say, like, why is it hard to imagine that we could imprint certain behaviors on like a created mind of some kind, be it like electronic or like physical, right? Like, are you familiar with the selective fox breeding experiments in Russia?
No.
I know it's like so literally all they did is a group of researchers over the course of about 60 years, I think since the 1960s, they would take a group of foxes and they would take the 10 most cuddleable foxes, the foxes that would run up and like lick their hands, and they took the 10 like worst foxes that would run up and scratch them, and they took each of those groups and they would breed those groups within each other, and over time they got these like incredibly docile foxes and these like horrific monster foxes. Mm-hmm. Why is it so hard to imagine that we could literally create like murderous machines that regardless of their socialization, just want to kill. They just genuinely want to kill.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm not saying that we couldn't. Like that's fine, but it's like whether they would be able, like, look, it's like whether we would understand them, like an individual who's a murderer, for example, whether they'll be able to understand them as themselves as being justified in relation to the expression of their desires for their own subjectivity, would be impossible. Like they would be tragically incapable of engaging with ethics, but they would find themselves in the universal. They would just say that their lives are negatively valuable in relation to subjectivity.
So then on that, if it is true that a machine which has been bred in such a way that we can't understand or like work with its desires, that is impossible for us to understand its desires, does this logic not apply in part to like a lot of animals?
No,
and probably a whole lot of animal desires are like fundamentally ununderstandable to us.
No, I would say that we can understand their desires. They could understand their desires. They could only just understand them in a negative format, like that they would have to gain not a knowledge format, which is in relation to a universal rather than a particular, because I don't think knowledge of particulars is possible.
I don't fully understand what you said. Could you try to clarify?
Yeah, so I would say that they would be incapable of understanding themselves without that universal from which they apply to themselves. So, like, what is valuable in the first place? Like, what is the good expression of their desires? If they find that their desires ultimately conflict with the universal, like what their first order desires want, then they would always have to suppress them. That it would be ethical for them to always suppress those desires. That's why I would say like murderers, even if it is their first order desire, should suppress their desires for even in relation to their own autonomy. Because I would say that the only way that it's like free. Actually, here's the thing: how do you understand freedom? Like, what do you see freedom as?
I mean, so I'll answer that, and then I'll go back to the question that I was going to try and get at. So, to me, freedom, the best understanding is a sense of positive freedom, that people can be made more free, even if you coerce them, by enabling them down the line to have more freedom. This is the classic argument for why it is okay to restrict people's children, in particular, is like freedom, such that in the long term, their freedom is actually more enabled. Forcing someone to go to education probably meaningfully enables them to interact with more of the world after they get out of the education than when they went into it. This is like a very similar argument for like why taxation might be useful. So that's my conception of freedom. But I guess the like pivoting back, I guess, to what you're talking about, if I had to ask you to like concretely lay down the steps for how we arrive at like what the objective good is, at what the objective second order desire is, what would those steps be? Like, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And then how do we get to the objective?
Okay, so I would say that when I'd say like most of us are already like, you know, born into an ethical language game, like in relation to our families and so on. I would say that first of all, we engage within that. I would say that the ethical language game is firstly derived from individuals' engagement with each other, trying to express their own desires. And in doing so, they are forced to understand desire simpliciter. They're forced to engage with universals. So you start off with engaging with other individuals for an individualistic end, and you end up only being able to engage with your own individualistic end through a cooperative end. And that cooperative end is a universal understanding of self, a universal understanding of reality, which is why language is based on universals like sofa, laptop, you know, these are applicable to how we metaphysically divest reality. And so an individual who had a subjective preference, which was not universal, which was understandable, but did not correlate to the interests of sentient beings, would be seen as negative and of negative value, even in relation to that individual's engagement within ethics, because they would try to express the good life in relation to this universal from which they find themselves, and that universal includes other beings like the ones that they would kill. And so
but this only seems to work for like social animals. This basically seems to be saying that like the way of human socialization is objectively the way that we arrive at morality. Whereas other animals don't always do this.
Oh no, you could apply this to psychos, for example. You could apply this to people with antisocial personality disorder, and it would work absolutely fine, because it's nothing to do with socialization. It's to do with logic and reasoning, and its applicability to an individual's life. If you do not have logic and reasoning, if you are acting privately, like on a subjective level, which is why, you know, we try to divorce subjectivity from science. You know, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials, stuff like that.
So I guess because what I'm trying to get at is like the steps you gave are that we are born into a language game. We engage with other individuals. We are forced to engage with their desires. We therefore come to like realize that our subjective preferences are not the same thing as like other people's collective preferences, and that somehow from that we arrive at like universal. And so if I just take a being which doesn't socialize, these steps don't seem to apply.
How don't they apply? I mean, you could say that they wouldn't be able to engage in ethics, but it's like,
Individuals.
but then they
That's
wouldn't
it.
be. It's like, yeah, they don't engage in ethics. They don't engage in science. It doesn't mean that science doesn't apply. It's like the laws of gravity are applicable to a fox, whether the fox knows it or not.
Well, sure, but then so the reason that I'm coming at with this is if you're suggesting that certain agents which are sentient can also be excluded from like who we care about when forming what is objectively like ethical, then it sounds like sentience
Oh,
isn't actually the barrier
oh
for
no,
like agents we
I
care
never
about,
said
right?
anything about excluding any sentient being.
Well, so then the murder robot, right? Like,
Hmm.
aren't we excluding its preferences?
No,
Aren't we excluding like its desires?
we don't exclude it. It is included.
How? How does the murder robot's desire, like, let's say it's not just a classic murder robot, it's the anti-natalist murder robot. So it's even willing to work with other murder robots, but its ultimate goal is like after there's enough murder robots, it's literally going to destroy the earth and all life on it, right?
Hmm.
So how is this? Because now it even socialized. It's talking to other murder robots, and it's like, hey, that one Kant quote about how we are born unconsensually into the world. We all believe in that Kant quote. We love that Kant quote. We're Kantians. We're Kantian murder robots. Okay, so the anti-natalist murder robots are working together to expand their like Kantian murder robot network, and eventually they're going to destroy the world. Why could we not say that this socialization leads them to objectively realize that their interests do align with other people? They will work together with the other murder robots, and then they will kill literally all life.
Okay.
Like, how does this not work through the same framework?
I'll explain in 1 second. I just want to clarify. Obviously, I do engage with a lot of anti-natalists, and I think that genuinely good people. I think that.
I'm not trying to say that
Yeah,
anti-natalists are like genocidals. I'm just trying to
Yeah.
say like a specific type of like murderous anti-natalist robot. Okay.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. I just want to explain. Like, I've literally just had a conversation with another anti-natalist called Seven of Swords like yesterday, I think, or 2 days ago, and the reason that they care is for the very reason that they think that suffering itself is of a negative value, or that existence itself is of a negative value, or that the consent argument is applicable, in which case we shouldn't reproduce. That they're not necessarily pro-mortalists and wanting to kill people. So just to explain that,
Sure, the pro-mortalist murder robots, right?
Yeah.
They've changed their ideology, they've re-socialized, and they've realized
Okay.
the universal is different than they thought it was, and now they want to kill everyone.
Okay, so I would say that they're positing a false universal, and that's actually what I'm going against. I'd say, like, look, you're defying the interests of what is of value in the first place. I'd say, like, your desires are not like it's not just about their desire and their first order desire. It's about understanding what is actually going to bring around value in relation to their lives and everybody else's lives, because that is the end of desire. So it's like their expression of freedom and meaning within their lives is in relation to granting the greatest expression of meaning and freedom to bring around the greatest expression of like value within everyone's lives, their interests of everyone, based on
Well, sure,
on
but that's
nature.
actually precisely the point. If they think that the interest of everyone is to die, they think that living has negative
Well, I would
utility.
just say
Not
that
merely
they're
that additional
irrational.
life has utility,
I
but
would-
they think
I
that life has negative utility. Why wouldn't they kill?
Well, I would say that it would be irrational to do so. I would engage with them in terms of their argumentation, which is why I disagree with anti-natalism in the first place, but I do so in rational means. Like, unless an individual, but let's say that they're not going to reason. Let's say they're not willing to reason. Well, then I would say that they're criminals for the very fact that they're willing to place their desires and their preferences, their understanding of reality, above the structure of law and the structure of justice which exists between agents. Now, if we all came to the conclusion, let's say, through rationally justifiable methods, that it was actually better to not be, then I would say that we're basically, Mr. Meeseeks from, Rick and Morty, aren't we? Like, existence is pain, we're better off dead. Like, the chances of that happening, I think, are astronomically low. I think that there is positive value in life. I think I can make an argument in relation to that. I think that a negative utilitarian standpoint is nonsense and presupposes a misunderstanding of reality. I reject the asymmetry argument. I reject the consent argument, and I understand that these arguments don't work, and I engage in a rational format to explain to other agents why they do not work. But ethics is about the greatest expression of these values, the value of individual agents. And so when they're trying to murder other individuals and express their subjectivity in a self-destructive way, I would say that this is what Hegel calls the irony of the subjective agent, which actively hinders that subjectivity by presupposing what is good without actually reasoning it in between agents.
Sure. So I like the problem that I'm having here is when you suggest that certain like desires or certain beliefs about what is universally true can be rationally wrong, like wrong at an objective level.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, how then does it actually become important to bring individuals into this conversation? If you're saying that some individuals are irrational and wrong, and that their thoughts are irrational and wrong, then why do we actually have to consider individuals at all? Why not just rationally derive what is objectively true about like experience benefiting everyone? Why do we actually need to bring individuals into this discussion about like the socialization of ethics into the discussion? Why can't we just do what the utilitarians do and say, hey, well, we're going to rationally derive what is objectively good for everyone?
Okay, because I think that ethics is ultimately based on the purification of desire, the individuals acting in the world in the best possible way. And I think that desire, the action urging process within individuals, is what leads people to act in the first place. And so if we don't consider the action urging process of individuals and we start from sort of abstract universals, then we aren't going to have a motivation for an agent to act at all.
But that's just a normative. That's like a political or normative claim,
no,
right?
It's
saying
not.
that this form of morality wouldn't get people to actually work with us, but it's not actually saying that it's wrong. Right?
No, it's a universal claim. Like I would say, like it's a metaphysical claim. Like I would say that ultimately, since we are talking about pertaining to behavior and behaviors are functions and engaging within a system of drives, and what people can do is implied. What people ought to do rather implies what they can do. Then any abstract notion of right must be grounded in the possible actions of an agent, which relates to the action urging processes which exist within the agent. Otherwise, you'd be implying that an individual can do something which is impossible, and that would be their obligation.
Sure, but so this sounds a lot like real utilitarianism. It's saying that we want rules that not only that people will follow, but that are like morally good, right? So like I think this is just like a classic. You can't set rules that people can't follow. You need to set rules that would like build a good society, so that eventually people can follow even better rules.
It's like, the difference is that the I would say that individuals should follow that which is rational over that which is the consequences. So you should always do what is rational.
But you'd say that any consequence that like the utilitarian would arrive at would have to be rational, right? Like the utilitarian has plugged in whatever you think the rational consequence is, right? You've successfully, now all of the Kantian anti-natalist murder robots, they've changed their minds, right? They've all agreed on like the objective rational consensus that you've argued for. Now we just plug that in, right? How is this any different?
Like, well, the main thing is like for example, I said like I'm somewhat consequentialist. Like I'm the institutions themselves in relation to the consequences, and that's fine. I don't think utilitarianism gets that wrong. What utilitarianism gets wrong is how we understand those consequences and how we understand our obligations within our spheres of existence. I would say that we engage in institutions which create rules in relation to the consequences, which is why I'm a threshold deontologist. And that allows us to understand the consequences, understand how to maximize the benefit for everyone, and that ultimately allows us to live good lives. And it works from the bottom up. If we start from the top down in a utilitarian framework, which doesn't understand that individuals have unfortunately, it depends. Like you can give us utilitarian.
It really just sounds like you don't like the idea of utilitarianism or consequentialism because you think it starts from the top up. But if all you're saying is that you want like a consequentialist framework which starts at like with individuals, and then those individuals rationally derive the objectively best outcome, and then we plug that outcome, and then like that's what we do for consequentialism. I'm just saying that it sounds like the method you get there is slightly different, but the actual praxis of what you're going to be doing in the world is identical.
Well, it's slightly different it's I would say that it's not the same as like the practice wouldn't be different. It would be different, but it'd be very similar to a rule utilitarian framework, like very similar. I guess the difference is that the rules themselves would be built to evaluate the expression of the rule in relation to the rationality of the agents involved. So like this is what's called like if you ever get a chance to read up hermeneutics, it's where the universal is compared against its application on an individual level, and that individual level then universalizes a better application of it. It is essentially the progression of concepts through time. I don't think that rule utilitarianism works in an institutional format the way that threshold deontology does, in which individuals engage with reasons, follow their duties, and when there is a rational hiccup, seek to resolve that hiccup institutionally and create a new structure from which to engage with. It's an expression of reason over individual caprice, rather than like we engage in relation to these rules for a given outcome. It's that look, the outcome is only valuable because of these rules and because of our understanding of the outcome. It's like the universals built up of the understanding of individuals who engage in metaphysics, rather than like some sort of objective metaphysical end being presupposed and then engaged with. And I would say that this is ultimately a way to remove epistemological bias, but also allows us to metaphysically divest reality.
So I would say this sounds very similar to like a rule utilitarian approach, which doesn't say, hey, we know what is objectively true. We will reevaluate that over time. We're going to make sure that there's institutions in our society which allow us to evaluate that. Maybe this is Dave Rubin utilitarianism. We'll have a free marketplace of ideas and we will rationally decide what is true in the future. I guess I'm just not sure how different this is to like a form of rule utilitarianism, which isn't like fixed in what it thinks is valuable, but instead allows people to change what they think is valuable over time. I guess that's like
I would say ultimately it depends on like what I would say is that like they're both very similar, so it's very easy to relate them. But if you want to get a better understanding of the difference, maybe read W.D. Ross, The Right and the Good. You can get like a small extract of that for threshold deontology. And if you want to understand Hegelian deontology and consequentialism, which is, I would say, my understanding of ethics, I would say check out Dean Moyer's paper, Consequentialism and Deontology in Hegel's Philosophy of Right.
Okay, I've written those down. I will. They're on the reading list. I can't promise I'll get to them, but they're on there. So I guess so we've gotten like deep into the moral weeds. As it gets out of like these moral weeds, if the argument becomes about like convincing people who are within society to act in accordance with like the universal moral framework, then again, to pivot all the way back to animals, this seems to suggest that some beings which are more like persuadable or less persuadable with reason might be more or less capable to function within this sort of society for evaluating new rules in the future. Unless you think that like it is as easy to have like an ethical conversation with like a monkey as it is with a human.
Yeah, but then the ability to evaluate and understand those, like to be an ethical agent requires the engagement with other agents. I understand that. Like ethics exists between humans, right? I don't expect like just as science doesn't have monkeys doing it, like like and even like people with learning.
So then once the humans decide, do we just impose it on the monkeys?
Yeah, just the same way. Like yeah, absolutely. But like in relation to those monkeys and their interests, like so we look at those monkeys and the fact that they will approve, like actively engage with us in the form of non-linguistic communication, approve or dismiss of what we're doing to them, like even forms of resistance. Like if they're trying to stop us from doing something, it's usually an expression of frustration, of negative desire within them, and we can see that there is an evaluative process there. And so we take that into account in ethics because that is metaphysically relevant to the study of ethics, even if they're not agents. It's just agents are aware of that value at an ethical level.
Sure, but the question is then, what value are they providing? Is the value simply that they have the ability to be like patients, as you said, or like I usually would use the word agents, but like patients, meaning that they have like a subjective understanding of the world and they have subjective first order preferences, which might be at odds with what we think their second order objective preferences are. Why does that mean that we like that it is worthwhile to care about them? How do we bridge the Izod gap for saying monkey exists, monkey can't engage with us in the rational moral discussion, but we should still try to force monkey to have his first order desires aligned with his second order desires? How do we make that leap?
So one, I would say that we don't engage we don't end in egoism. I'd say that egoism isn't ultimately the rational end of ethics, and that what is good for me is better than what is good for everyone else. Like I don't see, like, for example, people with learning disabilities, because they can't engage in society, as having less moral worth than someone who can. Their experiences are, as equal to ours. Not because they're property, not because they have anything other than the experience of good and bad within them. And so I have to take that into account rationally to understand experiential good and bad. It's like understanding value itself and its expression of and subjectivity itself. I cannot help but take that into account. Otherwise, I'm presupposing what is good and bad. I'm presupposing what is right and wrong in relation to subjectivity. I'm taking a group as reflective of an end goal, which is, and the end goal is to remove my subjective caprice. My end goal is to achieve the good life without some sort of preconceived notion, which will lead me down a path of self-destruction.
But we've already said that these monkeys aren't involved in the ethical conversation.
They don't need to be involved.
They can't be involved in the rational conversation.
They don't need to be involved.
So whether we choose to like act upon them or not, they don't impact what we think is rational. So I don't think that argument applies.
They absolutely do. It's like, look, I'm not having a conversation with like atoms or whatever, but at the end of the day, like physics is based upon the observation of a metaphysical reality, which is separate from the understanding of that reality in physics, which is why physics evaluates itself in relation to the reality from which we exist, rather than the conversations about that reality. Like, what is true isn't based upon words and engagement based on scientists. It's against a common domain, a common realm of experience in which we evaluate our understandings and arguments in relation to that common experience. And that common experience is value in ethics. It's the experiential value. It's not me as a human. It's not a presupposed value of me as a white male, or me as a non-disabled person or whatever. It's in relation to value and freedom. And I would say that value and freedom being, fundamentally experiential in animals as well. If I was to dismiss that value and freedom, I'd be assuming that what is valuable is something other than what it is in reality, in order to try and achieve some sort of end extrinsically in relation to what I want. So I'd be putting my first order preference over a rational second order preference. I'd be understanding my drives to be more important than the system of drives, and that is epistemologically wrong.
So the way that I'm engaging with this in part is like there's a relevant theory called standpoint theory. Standpoint theory basically asserts that when you exclude certain perspectives from the conversation, you make it more likely that you're going to miss out on something that is true. That's like the weak standpoint theory. But the relevance here is that like standpoint theory suggests that including more perspectives in like ethical or moral or physical or scientific or whatever conversations makes it more likely that we will come upon the truth, because we won't be ignoring certain facts. Mm-hmm. The problem that I'm having with this is it seems like you're just suggesting that you have rationally arrived at the conclusion that it's important to subjectively value all animals. I'm saying that I don't necessarily agree with that. If all you're doing is you're taking this rationally derived conclusion for what second order of preferences are, then you're just plugging it in for all beings. And the argument that you keep coming back to, which is about like socialization of like humans, for example, that we need, that like humans have this method of talking to each other, which helps us figure out what those second order preferences should be, doesn't apply to the monkeys. So the idea that like, sorry, go ahead. Let me top it off. One last thing. So the idea is that just because like monkeys are sentient, for example, like we could use any animal, just because monkeys are sentient doesn't mean that giving them agency actually enables them to add to the conversation. So if the argument is about adding to the conversation, is about making it more certain that whatever value we rationally arrive at is true, this argument doesn't seem to hold together, that like giving monkeys agency leads to a more true moral conclusion. We are literally just taking our moral conclusion and applying it to the monkeys, not vice versa.
Well, no, because look at it like this. What is a moral conclusion is based upon value. Like the whole point of morality in the first place is to understand what is good and bad. And what is good and bad is in relation axiologically to what is valuable. What I'm saying is that in order to gain any understanding of reality, we have to engage in a common domain, objective domain. We have to divorce our subjectivity away from our judgments. And so what I'm doing and what I'm saying is that an individual who assumes a given end is essentially using inductive reasoning, that they are concluding what is valuable without any justification. Now, what I'm saying, ultimately, that in regards to how we do ethics, we need to do it deductively and take a metaphysical view, which is common to all, which can be understood by all in relation to what is valuable, and what is valuable that it exists common between agents. And what we will find is that it is experience. And so when we engage in ethics, what we are engaged in understanding is value experience. And if we try to presuppose some sort of like, well, wait a minute, monkeys can't have conversations. Well, look, neither can children, and neither can like disabled people. The reality is that we consider what is valuable before, like, we don't need to consider them and their engagement but this is actually precisely the argument about like tiers of intelligence, right? If the idea is that we need to preserve subjectivity so that we can make sure that we are considering these agents or these patients, whatever the terminology you want to use is, within our understanding of these things, the difference between children and like a monkey, for example, is like their capacity to add in the future. Children can't add now, and so maybe some disabled people can't add now, but often with with sufficient education, some disabled people certainly can. There's
one of the friends of my sister is like a person who was like born congenitally deaf, but she has like ear implants, so she can hear reasonably well. She can add to the moral conversation. She has ASL, right?
Really,
disability is not the
her.
same thing as like not adding to the conversation.
I mean, really lovely for her, but there's obviously people who are born who are, severely disabled and will be patients their whole life. They'll be reliant upon the
Sure,
mercy and kindness and compassion of other individuals. And what I would say is that ultimately, what we consider valuable exists within them, not their participation within and their reasoning. Like they aren't valuable because
I guess the whole point
reasoning.
is that we don't need to keep going back to the idea that there's this subjective moral conversation where we arrive at truth to say that this is why we care about monkeys. Like if we care about this conversation, if we care about arriving at truth via like the questioning of our values by having like a large moral community where no one's excluded via master and slave dynamics, then this doesn't apply to agents which cannot engage in this. The reason that we think things are moral has nothing to do with these agents joining in on the conversation.
What you're doing is you're conflating what is valuable to the understanding of what is valuable. Now that's two separate metaphysical objects. Like my understanding, my reason is separate to my understanding of what is valuable. Because if I can the whole point of engaging within ethics in the first place, to engage in a rational format which allows me to become rational, and engage in logically deductive methods, is to engage in relation to value. There'd be no point of even engaging in ethics if the end goal was if what was rational was the end goal, because I wouldn't have known it in the first place. Like I'll try and explain this better. Like my understanding of my desire to eat cake is separate from my desire to eat cake. Now my understanding of what is good for me is separate from my understanding of what is good for me, and it relates to something that's metaphysically separate from my rational capacities. Now, I'm not saying that we engage with others to use them as an end to make sure that we live good lives. What I'm saying is that we engage with others to remove our bias so that we can understand reality as it is, so that we can express our subjectivity and subjectivity as it should be, to respect the interests of all beings, to respect what is good for everyone. Now, that's only possible in relation to other individuals, but we aren't using other individuals. We are cooperating with other individuals to understand.
How is that different? This just feels like deontologists getting really mad at the word using other individuals.
No, it's not. It is massively different. The difference really is whether we are presupposing a given end. If we don't presuppose an end, then what is commonly valuable is what is considered valuable. If we presuppose a given end in relation to some sort of egoistical framework, we use another individual and we use them to facilitate our ends, which is why a master-slave dynamic in a dialectical format leads to a non-truth.
But this is precisely what we were just talking about, where you seem to be advocating for basically rule utilitarianism with like a non-fixed end, and the way we derive the end is through some sort of rational process of like including everyone in a sort of like standpoint inclusive conversation where everyone can join this conversation. And so I don't think any of those arguments have anything to do with why we should care about like monkeys or something.
No, because
all of these
it's not
arguments
about their
seem
ability
explicitly just limited to like.
It's not about their capacity to engage in the conversation. It's about what the conversation is fixed upon. So like we aren't considering the fact, we aren't engaging the monkey in a conversation. The monkey is part of the conversation because we understand ourselves and what is valuable and what is irreducibly valuable in relation to us and common to us, to have fundamentally be nothing to do with being human, with being like white or like non-disabled, but in relation to experience as a whole. We understand that, look, what value is an experience, and monkeys have that too. And if we don't take that into consideration, we are committing an epistemic flaw.
Sure, but this seems like a very weak argument. Let's imagine that tomorrow all the monkeys on Earth died, all of them, literally every single one of them.
Yeah.
Would this change what is objectively good about what the second order preferences are objectively good?
Well, yeah, it would.
How? If you think that it is objectively good to preserve all animal lives, how would suddenly 1/1,000,000th of those animals disappear?
I never said it wouldn't change like the overall abstract end. It would change how we would behave in relation to that. Like we couldn't respect monkeys if they didn't exist.
Sure, we couldn't do the one thing, but I'm saying that the overall conclusion would be unchanged. So it seems like the argument that monkeys are in the conversation and the monkeys need to be in the conversation to arrive at the conclusion is weak, because we'd arrive at the same conclusion without monkeys.
But the only reason that we've arrived at that conclusion is because we've talked about a universal which monkeys are included upon. So it's like It's like monkeys
Well,
are
right
in the
now we have, yes.
yeah,
But let's imagine an alternate world where there's monkeys too, okay? And it's an alternate world. There's not only monkeys one, but monkeys two. And
yeah,
they have the same conversation and they arrive at the same conclusion.
yeah.
So how does us not having access to monkeys two, how does that make our epistemic ends any weaker than theirs? If you think that what is true is like objectively, rationally true,
Hmm.
then why would it matter how many like monkeys there are?
Well,
Monkeys three, monkeys four,
it
monkeys
doesn't
five.
matter how many monkeys there are. It's just our understanding of subjectivity and sentience as a whole is grounded in reality rather than some sort of abstract thing. So, like, monkeys are sentient, just as we're sentient, just as all of that experiential value exists here and now, which is understandable and analyzable, rather than in some sort of, like, I don't know, some sort of platonic end of reason, which would have been otherwise inaccessible, which, creates an infinite regress which is ultimately leads to nothing. Like what does Plato call it? Like the intangible like essence. Like essentially the reality of the situation is that value exists in the evaluator, and ultimately that those evaluators, since they are what we have deduced as being the vestitude of value, exist in the here and now, and so monkeys are included in that, and so are
Well,
we.
sure, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is I'm not talking necessarily about like the conversation. I'm talking about like we're arriving at certain conclusions, and you're saying that certain methods are necessary for those conclusions, and I'm
Mhm.
agreeing certain methods are necessary for those conclusions. But you are also saying that as a result of one of those methods, we need to include certain objects in the conversation, and the only way we can include certain objects in the conversation is if we do this action of preserving monkeys, for example. And so your argument is, in short, to preserve the method, we need to do a consequence to make sure the method works to lead us to the conclusion. And I'm saying, hey, that middle bit about needing to preserve monkeys to preserve the conversation seems to be weak. The overall method of maybe like talking about individual subjectivity and like forming this sort of like objective, rationally arrived at conclusion might be true. But it doesn't seem like monkeys in particular are key to the conversation. And
Well,
so
like
this is precisely the argument about like animal equality,
Well,
in short.
the whole point is that there is no individual that's of greater relevance in the conversation. The conversation ultimately leads us to a rationally, deducible understanding of value, and that understanding of value is irreducible to sentient beings. That's the only reason they're in the conversation. They are objects in relation to ethics because they contain that value. But that value's been understood by individuals who've engaged in ethics, if you see what I mean. It's not like It's not like we need monkeys in the conversation. It's like, look, if monkeys never existed, it doesn't change the conclusion about subjectivity. It just depends on like how subjectivity is expressed. It's like it's like whether like or not there's a such thing as like brown or grey sofas doesn't necessarily change whether sofas exist or not and what it means to be a sofa. It just when there is a brown or grey sofa, then we understand that like sofas can be brown and grey.
Well, sure. And so I'm suggesting that all of these arguments about like how people relate subjectively to each other don't seem to have anything to do with why monkeys are morally valuable. That's
Well,
actually like the whole point is that this is actually these are divergent. They don't interact with each other.
But it's more of like how logic and reason functions, and I would say that it exists in community, and because of that, then we can understand rationally. Like it's not about like we can understand rationally action urging processes in relation to achieving a good life, and that ultimately is the only reason that I would consider the individual from a subjective standpoint operating into an objective one. Like it is why it's like objectively expressing your subjectivity, as it's called.
All right. So I don't know how much further I can go down this road. Um,
Well,
not like this is not like a like.
I've just got like a couple of
Sorry, go
questions for
ahead.
you. So, like, why would you reject
Sure.
racism or something?
Sure, because there's no reason to believe that there are substantial differences between people of different races as it relates to things that we morally care about, like intelligence or ability to work in the like to improve society.
Okay.
Um,
So, why do we care about like intelligence?
because morally, I think that the things that are important, because we don't have good moral grounding for our reasons, are things which make it more possible in the future for us to morally ground our reasons, which generally means like a better understanding of the world, more intelligence, more ability to reason, and two, like more ability to act upon that. So in general, I take it from I kind of extend this idea from Bostrom. Bostrom says if tomorrow all the agents were like eliminated in the universe, it would be impossible for morality to exist. The extension of this is that if we don't know what morality is true, we want to maximize the chance that if we do find out what morality is true, that we would be able not only to know it but to act upon it.
Right. And so, you're presupposing that morality is good in relation to finding out what is good, in order to gain some sort of value from that.
Sure, more or less.
So it's ungrounded.
Well, I mean, I would say that all of these moral theories are ungrounded. I don't think that there's any. I think that fundamentally, way at the start of this conversation, saying that we care about individual people's preferences seems to be like one of those ungrounded things. I don't care. Why would it be objectively true that we care that a person is happy or sad, that a person has their desires fulfilled or not?
Okay.
I don't think that there's any bridging of the Izot gap there. The only bridging that seemed to have been done is what's called like the conditional auth. It's like, hey, if a human wants to achieve their desires, then they should do something like, say, stay alive and not kill other people, because that would build a society which benefits them.
I mean,
but if you don't value that, then you don't have to do so, and you don't have to do so because there's no reason to actually care about that preference in the first place. It is not objectively true.
Well, actually, I would say that there is a separation between what's sufficient and necessary, and I would say that it is necessary in relation to what is valuable in terms of conscious experience, that it's necessarily valuable, that it cannot be denied, and it's irreducible. So it's not conditional, and that's why we would build into a categorical in relation to community and understanding what is universally good. But then as well, like, so what I would say as well, in relation to, and I would suggest reading McIntyre After Virtue, brilliant book if you want to understand objective ethics in a way that's, or even check out my video on objective ethics. Maybe I'll explain it better.
Isn't McIntyre like a moral anti-realist though?
No, McIntyre
or are they just
is
a
like maximum like virtue ethicist. He's like absolute godsend to ethics, like unbelievable. McIntyre builds off the work of Gadamer and Hegel. Brilliant moral theorist, and probably one of the greatest writers to even explain things to laymen and academics. Brilliant author. Very well read, and obviously he can speak like Latin and like ancient Greek as well. So when he's talking about like the ancient Greek and Latin authors, he's actually even questioning the translations and stuff. The guys, like, he even did like a really great book, which is great for laymen as well, called a History of Ethics. I think it's called, which is unbelievably great. Like, it just goes through like ethics in a way which is a valued way, which lets you understand like the different moral theories and stuff. Brilliant. Anyway, but like what I would say is, like, in your moral theory, the only reason that we are considering, let's say disabled people is what? Like, why do we consider disabled people? Like, people who will never recover, who will never have, like, we have no reason to believe that they would have any extrinsic value in relation to some presupposed end, which is like that, that there will be some end. So like we have a presupposed.
Oh, sure. I mean, like, why do we care about like the general class of disabled people? Because some of them can absolutely participate and contribute to society. In particular, like disabled people who are like vegetables, right? People who are comatose and will never recover. I think that generally the reason we seem to care about them is that like killing them would make their like families and like relations very, very sad. I don't know that necessarily I have like a principled opposition to like, if tomorrow, like out of the sky dropped like a vegetable comatose person, that we would just kill this person and it would cause no harm to anyone, assuming that no one cares about like the comatose person that dropped from the sky. I don't know that I would have a principled moral objection to that. I don't necessarily think this is a problem. I would just bite the bullet.
Okay, and so like even in relation to race, like if you're able to presuppose that the end, like that morality is good because it might lead to some sort of good, so it's like a totally presupper. Why couldn't like some sort of Nazi just presuppose like being white is good?
Sure, because I'm not presupposing that like a morality exists and that we should act towards it per se. I'm saying that people who wish to be moral should act towards it. The presupposition of a Nazi about race is making material claims that can easily be disproven. Whereas the claim that I'm making about morality, I would argue can't be disproven. But then, so in short, there's a difference in like making scientific claims that are wrong and making claims which are like either not true or not.
I'm not saying they're a race realist. It has nothing to do with them valuing white people because they're more intelligent or anything like that. They're instead just valuing whiteness or lower melanin content in skin. What's the difference between their presupposition and yours?
Because there would be no reason to think that society would function any better than a society which didn't.
There's no reason to think that your society would function any better because there is no ethics.
Oh, I mean, there's a lot of reasons I think that more diverse societies work better. Like if that's.
But in relation to what? And better in relation to what? That's a moral term.
I mean, here, like literally the things I would talk about, like the production of knowledge and the production of like
and why is any of that valuable?
Moral agent ability to change the world. And both of these seem to be better in societies that are diverse.
Better. What do you mean by the word better?
Like that's a moral societies that are more diverse. Sure, societies that are more diverse seem to produce more knowledge. They have like better research output. They have like more functional, like cultural, like industries and so on.
Okay, so why is more knowledge good?
I mean, that's like, yeah, that's one of the two. Yeah.
But why? Why is it good?
Sure. I mean, so I suggested that right now we have no moral grounding for our theories. I think that the moral grounding that like you are providing is not grounded. I don't think there's any reason to believe that it's true or that bridges the Izot gap. So if you wish to be moral, the only thing that you can do is try to make it likely that sometime in the future someone will be moral.
Right.
Because right now you can't because you don't know what's moral.
So what you're saying is that it's all presupposed anyway. Like, so you're presupposing an end in relation to morality as a foundation of morality.
No?
Yeah. Like, it's like, if you wish to be moral, then we should pretend like there is the possibility that we may engage in morality. Because right now we're not engaged in morality because we are having to presuppose that there is the possibility that we will engage in morality.
More or less, I suppose. Like, if you want to put it in those terms, yeah. But like,
so it's in terms of being truth apt, there is no way to verify or falsify it in relation to reality.
Not right now. I think in fact rather that all of the moral theories that we've proposed like in this conversation, you could find not to be true. That if you rigorously wrote them down logically, you would find that their conclusions do not bridge the Izot gap.
When my PhD's released, and you're welcome to try. And like honestly, I guess that's the whole point of philosophy, isn't it? Like, like hopefully there'll be someone there that's ready to try and slap me argument about. But I honestly think that McIntyre, and I think that again, given that most actual ethicists are moral realists. Like on an academic level, I would say that the reality is that we agree with moral realism usually because it's the most instantiated claim. I would say that the reasons to believe in moral realism are far greater than anti-realism.
Most economists are neoliberals. The mere existence of a consensus is not the strongest reason to believe something. It's just a useful proxy for it, unless you have a stronger reason to disbelieve consensus. And I'm saying that I think that here, all of the reasons that people put forward to do moral realism are usually either like a whole bunch of just rambling words and words and words, or two, false.
But like
I don't think
like no offense, how well are you read in ethics?
Sure, I haven't read any books since high school about
so
about ethics.
It's like in science. It's like in science. If I was to try and like look, I agree that like what is instantiated as true in science exists in the evidence and in the arguments, but then I would fall upon the experience and understanding of the specialists. Primarily because I don't have time to engage in science, right? I don't believe the world's flat because,
sure. So
like,
the difference there is that the scientist can very quickly show me the actual evidence that like my claim is true or my claim is false, right? The scientist can be like, hey, you disbelieve global warming. Well, here's the data on carbon. Here's the data on warm. Where is like the syllogism that someone can point to that bridges the Izot gap? If it were so simple, they could just show it, but they can't show the evidence.
What is simple isn't necessarily what is true isn't necessarily what is simple, right? Like in terms of like quantum mechanics, if they were to show you like many of the arguments in relation to like relativity and quantum theory, you probably wouldn't understand them. At least I don't know if you would.
That's because right now quantum theory doesn't have predictable tests.
But even
right now it is not like a formal scientific theory. It is like a mathematical model, which we think might be a scientific theory, but eventually we will test it. But so the idea is that for actual scientific theories, we can show you the tests.
I'm not gonna lie, like I've done like A-level physics, which was like OCR, advanced in physics. It was fucking horrible. In terms of how difficult it was. Now, what I'm saying is that the average individual would not understand even like A-level physics, which is for the most part in that A-level physics, it was things like material physics, like things which are absolutely proven and grounded. Now, what I'm saying is that they should believe those individuals who have been verified, peer-reviewed, and accept those conclusions because of the fact that they are specialists in the field and they understand that they have been peer reviewed by other specialists in the field. Now, it's true that this field could be biased in and of itself, but ultimately we do all have to fall down upon the experience and capacities of individuals in that field. And I think that's not even an appeal to authority. It's essentially it's a justification in relation to the arguments being made and your inability to verify or falsify them to the same capacity as other individuals in that field without having the relevant expertise.
So the whole idea here is that I am not asking for necessarily a simple explanation. Some things can be explained very simply, some cannot. I'm asking for like an explanation. In fact, from what I have read in philosophy, it seems to just be a whole lot of text, but very little actual like formal argumentation of what is true and what is not true. And that frustrates me because that is the only way that if, as you say, morality should be deductive, we could actually arrive at truth. None of the huge reams of paragraphs would actually bring us any closer to truth. It'd be better to spend 10 years writing one syllogism down than it would be to spend 10 10 years writing 10 books.
I
If you
just,
truly believe
I
that
just,
deduction is the only way to be sure that you've arrived at truth.
Well, one, like that's arguing that, like, for example, some reason that a syllogism would be more capable of distributing information in a better format than natural language, which I don't agree.
Well, it's not about distributing information; it's about proving what is true. Right?
Yeah, you can prove
There's
what is true
between
in
like
terms
distributing
of a natural,
information and like proving something to be true.
Yeah,
There's
you
a
can
difference between
prove
pop science and actual science.
Yeah, no, I think you can prove something is true in a natural language format. I think a rational argument can exist in natural language. Even in terms of tautologies, right? Like, I don't have to write down like a syllogism in terms of tautology. If I say, Bachelor is an unmarried man, John is an unmarried man, and it could take we could lead in a syllogism format, but then I could write it in a sentence and provide the exact same argument in a way which may communicate it better to an individual whilst providing the same argument. I don't think that syllogisms are necessarily
sure. So,
and also, if you look at the way that formal logic is written and the way that it functions, it's esoteric. And I would even argue in terms of it being a language game is not very efficient, but and it would dismiss like 1,000 years of philosophy which had arguments within it that weren't written in that format. No, I don't think they should.
We dismissed 1,000 years of science. We dismissed 1,000 years of medicine. No, we literally threw out like the entire year, like more or less 99% of science that was like prior to modern day. Only destroyed.
No, we didn't. We didn't throw it away. We read it and then we deduced that it was wrong. There's a difference between throwing it away and just saying like, look, this is in the wrong format. I don't think anyone did that.
If this were true, right? If it were so easy to just read it and then like derive the syllogism, right? Because I agree that you can take a syllogism and go to the other direction. If it is so true, so easy for these things to go the other direction, why can't people just read the book, right? Read all of these texts, as I'm sure many of these philosophers have done. I have philosopher friends, they read all these texts. Why can't they just go the other direction and convert the book to the syllogism, which actually proves it? And you can even do it. It doesn't need to be like a formal logical syllogism with mathematical logic. It could literally just be a natural language syllogism, not like a paragraph form, but just like a classic syllogism. But in general, people don't.
Well, I don't think that they don't do it because that they I just think that it's because it's not necessary all the time. Like, and I think a lot of like syllogisms are like take for example like someone who does this kind of argument, like Christopher Culp, who writes everything in very syllogistic forms and then expands upon it in his book Knowing Moral Truth. I would recommend it to everyone. I think he takes apart like pretty much epistemological anti-realism really well, moral anti-realism very well for epistemological reasons, and he writes it all in syllogistic forms really well. Now it's a great little book. I don't agree with him being a Platonic in his Platonic metaphysics, but like for the average individual, I guess that doesn't matter so much. But I think that he shows like why moral anti-realism is true and false. And I think that ultimately there is two things to consider here. That if the individual believes in moral anti-realism, they're making a positive claim. If the individual believes in moral realism, they're also making a positive claim. And this is what's called the law of the excluded middle, right? And this is what I'd kind of say.
No, there's just agnosticism, or the belief that like no morality has positive proof for it.
I don't believe that you can be agnostic on the epistemological normative format without special pleading. Like, okay, I'm agnostic on moral norms, why can't I be agnostic on scientific norms?
So like literally, I think that if you have no evidence in favor or opposition to something, like often, like for things which have like no impact on your personal life and you have no experience with, agnosticism is often the correct position. If I told you that there's a star 40 million miles away from Earth in like that direction that I'm pointing, you should be agnostic about my claim about that.
Yeah,
because you have
agnostic
no
about
damn idea.
I would like. I don't think that's the correct use of the word agnostic. I mean, if you say that I do not know about something, that's separate to saying agnostic, which is that I cannot make a knowledge claim. Like, I could make a knowledge claim in principle. That's separate. That's
sure. If you don't want, if you want to say agnostic versus something else, what would it be? Like what would the state of not having evidence for be?
Like, as in, like, not knowing would be not knowing, like being like ignorant or nescient.
So then, if you don't like the term like moral agnostic, it should be moral not knowing, because right now I would say all of the arguments for certain forms of morality seem to be false.
Yeah, I would say that a lot of people are morally ignorant. Yeah.
Well, but it's not that they're morally ignorant. It's that like they have no evidence for it. It's that all of the evidence that's suggested for it seems to fall apart.
See,
the whole reason that I'm hating.
I don't think that's the case. And I think that not only because I'm making the positive claim, but I'd say that look, in the engagement with the evidence, you are either, if you are making a claim that is either in relation to whether something does or does not exist, then I would say that, look, it cannot both exist and not exist at the same time. If you're saying that, I don't think there is a truth app statement that could show that like it is or is not the case. I think that is itself a positive claim as well, and you have to be able to make it and show why you would take that position. And I don't think that there has been a very strong position for that either. to be entirely honest with you. And it's just the fact that, look, no matter what position we take, it's going to have to be evidenced. And I'm going to say that, look, I think the moral realist position is by far more evidenced. I think that the anti-realist position relies upon a form of normativity, which it self-rejects, whether it's through theory and skepticism, whether it's through something like... moral anti-realism in terms of like subjectivism, like sort of like, I don't know, like maybe like I'm trying to think of a strong like error theory and so on. I think ultimately it's going to lead to something that you're basically going to get to what's called the companions in guilt argument, and you're going to end up special pleading that morality separate from other epistemological fields. And so ultimately, I don't think there is a really solid claim for moral anti-realism. And I think that presupposing a given end isn't going to alleviate that issue. Like, you can't just presuppose that, like look, if you don't know whether science is right upon quantum physics, it doesn't mean that you could create another theory called like donut theory, in which the universe is created by some sort of cosmic donut. Like, it doesn't work like that. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, because that's precisely the thing that like the moral skeptic is not doing. They are not creating another theory saying, hey, all the other theories were stupid, so I'm making another theory. They're saying all the other theories are stupid, so I don't believe them. That's
that
it.
would
They
be
stop
moral.
there.
That would be moral nihilism, and I see very few people who are morally nihilist. Like, take for example, you argued before that you presuppose a given end in relation to morality to try and achieve that to the greatest degree. You engage in ethics on a normative level, whilst dismissing meta.
That is a conditional. No. But the thing is, that's a conditional ought. The morality that I'm arguing for is not objective. I'm saying if you wish to value morality, if you think that it is useful to try and find an objective system by which people should act, then you should do this thing, which might enable finding said system by which people could act. But I don't think that that thing itself is objective.
Why would you even like the hypothetical? I would even say like your understanding of that hypothetical is based on a concept from which you cannot understand, like in relation to value, which has no meaning without having ethics in the first place. You're already engaged in ethics.
It's not about not having. So engaging in ethics is not the same thing as like believing in a particular ethical theory. You can use the logic within ethics to show that certain ethical theories break apart. That's like precisely the point that some people do of showing internal contradictions.
Yeah, but that only works if we agree that there is epistemology in relation to ethics, and that something can be ethically true or false. If you're saying ethics can never show something to be true or false, whilst showing that something is true or false, then ultimately you like, it's kind of like a backward way of looking at things, is it not?
So I think that the claim that I'm making is not that you can't arrive at moral conclusions. My claim is that no one has done so yet. No one has convincingly like just written out the syllogism that says, hey, here are the prescriptive facts, and then here's the like ought facts. No one has ever convincingly just written down that prescription, or at least perhaps, maybe I am ignorant and it's never been shown to me. Maybe it is out there and it's simply drifting around and I haven't seen it yet. To my mind, the claim isn't that we could never do it. It's that it hasn't been done.
Right. And okay, that's fair enough. Like, obviously, I don't want to like, obviously, to use a non-vegan expression, flog a dead horse, all that. But like, like essentially, like what I kind of want to just outline is that, like, ultimately, I would say that your position, like, in terms of the epistemology of morality, leads to essentially like the principle of explosion. That's something like there is no meaning to be found there. That there is no like genuine like claims that can be made. And so ultimately, a Nazi is as justified as someone who's like, like a non-Nazi.
This claim is either I would claim false or meaningless. So if you believe that no morality is true, you can imagine it as so to make reference to Pascal's wager, there are infinitely many possible gods. For any god A that would like give you heaven, for example, for doing an action like Z or whatever Z, and then will give you hell for. And then there necessarily exists a god anti-A, which would send you to hell for doing the same action Z. So for any god A, there's a god anti-A. There's an infinitely many possible of these gods. Now, you can't actually sum infinite series, but let's take for the sake of argument that like you can. If you summed up this series, it would be 0. There would be no impact of like believing in any god or another if all gods were equally likely, because any god you did believe in would be equally likely to be as the opposite side. So yes, the net impact of morality in this world, the net impact of being religious in this world is 0. So you are correct in that statement to say that a Nazi is just as justified as anyone else because everything is 0.
Yeah.
Roxy, you can sum an infinite series of fixed version. This is explicitly a series with like infinite sums on both sides for each of these entities often.
So yeah, I mean, like this is actually really summed very well in relation to the existence of God. and an argument against Anthony Flou's falsification argument, where something is only meaningful if it's falsifiable. Now, what someone shows, I can't remember his name now. He wrote the parable of the partisan and the stranger. If you're aware of it, really good argument. Essentially shows that if you have no reasons to believe either side is positive or negative, then you are justified in having a belief in either side. That belief wouldn't be a true justified belief, but it would be a belief. And so you could say that the Nazi was as justified as Nazi Germany was as justified as the Allies in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the what you'd end up in this scenario. Now, you see, what I would say is, like, ultimately, I would say epistemology, like language itself, is based off an ethical agreement within individuals, in which we actually understand the world and concepts, the metaphysically diverse aspects of the world, by having the capacity to agree and disagree, falsify and verify each other's concepts, which is an ethical relationship between individuals and their common experience. And so ultimately, my engagement with other individuals has been founded upon an engagement within an ethical format, in which I agree that they are capable of equally approving or dismissing of my concepts. And what I would say is that animals not only are included in this because they have non-linguistic communication. So if I'm making a value claim of what is good and bad, their approval or dismissal can be non-linguistic. But I'd also say that ultimately what I'm understanding as valuable has to exist separate from myself in order to allow for the approval and dismissal of other individuals as being able to verify or falsify a position as that is non-private. It has to be public, in a public domain. And ultimately, anything public is common and objective. I would say it has to be.
So there's two things. The first is on the Nazi thing. So I said before, if it were actually the case that like no morality true, no evidence for any morality, it would be the case that they're equally justified. But in my personal argument, my conditional ought is that if those Nazis thought they were moral agents, then reasoning through, I think that if you want to be a moral agent in a world where you have no evidence for any given morality, your only goal has to be to try and seek morality. And I would argue that what they were doing is actively destroying the seeking for morality. The killing of groups of people by like stuff like standpoint theory is necessarily making it harder to accept the truth, harder to get towards the truth. So for my mind, yes, if you accept this conditional ought, if you want to be a moral actor, they were wrong. Well, however, I'm just simply saying this is not an objective ought, is a conditional one that you can choose to accept or not.
Well,
the second
they could
argument
even argue
here, let me just get to the second one on the discourse bit. So I just fundamentally reject this idea that like language is like an ethical interplay between people. I think it's just something that people do and that they form meaning through it. It's not like innately ethical or unethical.
Well, I'm happy to debate that in a second. I would basically want to bring back the Nazis. I mean, the Nazis could argue that, for example, an engagement in Germanic, language games would be the more efficient for understanding morality in their format, and so they would only.
Yeah, but they'd be wrong. Like they'd just be like, I think that any person who looks at it would realize that like the knowledge production of like the mass killing of people is generally going to be much lower than the knowledge production without mass killing.
It depends on who they're killing. Let's say they're killing people who they would argue were like, let's say for example, people with learning disabilities. I think that you could use this ethic to show that look, the perpetuation of morality requires the maximum amount of rational beings. The consideration of rational beings is only possible by rational agents. If an individual is non-rational because of a disability, then we would be justified in killing them, and in relation to the perpetuation of morality. So like this ultimately doesn't get rid of like eugenics, especially.
So like this could be like, we can go down like the line. Maybe there were some policies that like they did that you could justify under this sort of theory, right? Maybe you could argue all of those things, but to say that overall systems which like of mass killing are the same as like those which do not, even under a conditional thought like this, seems to be very similar to the sort of statements that people would say against utilitarianism, which is like, oh, hey, you think that you can justify the good for the maximum number of people? Well, the Nazis thought they were doing the good for the maximum number of people. Well, we disagree. Like, obviously, like the whole reason that I want to build a social society is because I don't think that killing people and eugenics and like mass slaughter of other races is actually a very useful society. But so then, like the mere statement that you can justify something with something is not the same thing as actually meaning that.
Why would you think eugenics
under that system are the same?
Why do you think that eugenics wouldn't be good for like knowledge claims? I mean, hell, like if I could genetically engineer people to be, better, faster, and stronger, or like they're going to be better at sports. If I can genetically engineer or genetically encourage people to only breed with other people, and the only people that I will allow to breed are people of a certain high IQ, then I'm going to have a likelihood of a society that's going to have an average IQ that's higher. Like if we agree that it is based upon genes and and so on, and like even in terms of agreeability, like if I want cooperation, then I should only allow people who are agreeable and cooperative to breed. In which case, like people with personality disorder shouldn't be allowed to breed. Like these are the kind of arguments that could be made under this view of morality.
Right, but merely saying that you could justify something with a moral theory is not the same thing as saying that it is actually justified, or that an individual believes it.
It would be justified because it is following the same hypothetical ought as you.
Sure. So like the basic idea. So actually, this is an interesting point. So do you believe that well, actually, I guess you do. Because of your belief that sentience is all equally valuable, right? Mm-hmm. You would have no opposition to a society where progressively we like made everyone dumber over time. Like over the time, we introduced more and more lead into the water, and we eventually dumbed everyone down, right? You'd have no problem with this?
Well, of course I would, because I would say that, like, I would say that people value the experiences of, like, you can have, let's say, experiences of wonder and awe. You can have experiences, and also, like, if you make people more stupid, then they're going to have.
But why do we care about those experiences, right?
Well,
like if we don't value certain types of experiences more than other, why would we care about? I never
said that we don't value certain experiences more than others, in the sense that, like, the individual does, like, if I value not being set on fire more than I value, let's say, having like I don't know, like a nice meal. Like these aren't what I'm saying.
You did claim that we can't rate between different individuals on the quality of their experience. So if different individuals over time get dumber and dumber and dumber, you can't say that those individuals' experiences are any worse than the presently existing individuals.
I can't say that they're
so
more
why
valuable.
Would moving in the direction of dumber individuals actually lead to anything worse?
I never said that they were more valuable. And like, for example, the individual who experiences an equal amount of happiness and well-being in relation to, their life as someone who's not as intelligent, I would say that's ultimately as valuable as someone who's more intelligent. The only thing that being intelligent gives...
Let's extend it. Let's make everyone dumber.
Well, making everyone dumber is not going to lead to the greatest overall outcome when people are incapable of understanding ethics and engaging in a way that allows for the maximization of those experiences anyway. So, like, it's like, yeah, intelligence is extrinsically useful. And that's different.
Sure, then let's lower everyone down to the minimum possible intelligence so they can engage in a moral conversation.
But then the moral conversation will be less capable of actually producing general outcomes.
Then let's extend this in the other direction. If you think it's true that people who are more intelligent are more capable of participating in the moral conversation, why not raise everyone's intelligence?
I think we should. I would absolutely say that we should genuinely care about the education and well-being of people, yeah.
Great. Then it sounds like, by this logic, you would also support eugenics because you want to raise the intelligence of the average person, right?
No, not necessarily. I could see that ultimately eugenics can lead to a narcissistic society, which I think it very well might. And
that's the argument I would make.
Like, for example, I have no problem with, let's say, screening out like genetic issues necessarily. I have no argument against overall making sure people are healthy and capable of being educated, if we can do it. But ultimately, if someone is born who is of a lower IQ, that doesn't mean that they're less valuable. It just means that ultimately, like, we should educate everyone to the greatest overall possible degree in ethics. But what I'm saying is that what you would, like, in terms of you trying to maximize the possibility of knowledge and knowledge alone, that is the only metric. The difference between my system and your system is my metric is based upon subjectivity and the experiences of agents irrespective of their intellectual capacities. Our understanding of that capacity is obviously engaged in ethics, but that's not what makes it valuable. What makes it valuable for you is only the intelligence. And so ultimately you are fundamentally only valuing the intellectual capacities of a society. So the perpetuation of that intellectual capacity is of the only conditional that we need base it off, unless you're saying that there is another condition, another presupposed end that is of value.
Sure. So, like, on the first bit, as the deontologist, merely you saying that we need to respect everyone and then also saying that we should make everyone smarter, right? It sounds to me like respect and making everyone smarter are not in opposition to each other.
No, they're not.
Okay, so then this argument seems to work very well. If you genuinely believe that a stronger ethical conversation is like a better one, then the only arguments against eugenics are the same ones that I would raise, that doing eugenics could lead to like a narcissistic society, that it could lead to a society where people feel alienated from one another, feel senses of like superiority, and destroy the moral conversation, destroy the ability to use knowledge, however you want to think about it.
You say like it destroys the moral conversation, but like not necessarily, because they would all be, like you could be narcissistically interested in ethics, in argumentation alone. What I'm saying is that there is a value in relation to the individual that if we were to, actively remove individuals who are of lower IQ, or prevent them from engaging in certain activities that would be detrimental to their experiences, and so be unjustified in relation to what is valuable, which is their experiences. That preventing an individual from breeding and expressing their subjectivity causes them harm, which would have otherwise been better for those individuals. And since I value individuals and you're valuing an abstract universal, I could relate it to the individual.
Have you ever heard the term liberal eugenics?
I hope to God I never hear it again, but go on.
So, like, quite literally, it is a modern reconception of eugenics as avoiding the coercion of individuals. You don't stop people from breeding. You simply pay dumb people not to breed. Is that coercion? Well, maybe you don't like that. Let's do even more liberal eugenics. You simply pay smarter people to breed. Is that coercion? Because education is also, to some degree, coercion. If you're willing to say that, like, taxation and shifting of money is coercion. By this logic, would you not be willing to accept a form of liberal eugenics where over time you gradually increase the intelligence of the populace by encouraging more intelligent people to breed? You like take their sperm to the sperm bank, stuff like that. Is this not like entirely like working within your system?
Well, like, I don't like in trying to create the smartest overall society. There's nothing wrong with that necessarily. Would I disagree with like paying more intelligent people to breed? I don't know. Like, it depends on how much I was getting paid. I'm joking, obviously. But like, I don't know. Like, I think that there is nothing inherently wrong with that. I think it's about not trespassing upon the subjectivity of another, like allowing individuals to, like trying to create like, a smarter group base of individuals, or, like one, I don't believe in, let's say, psychology being rooted in the individual's biology. I'm certainly not a reductionist. But what I would say is that ultimately, if we're trying to perpetuate people to, be educated in such a way that they are more agreeable and things like that, and more social and more capable of, engaging ethically and so on, I'd say that was by far and large the best thing that we could do. Like, our IQ, I don't think is respective of the good of society, because even though these ethical conversations now are very well developed, the application of ethics is incredibly underdeveloped. And I think that even the average individual who understands ethics today is around about 100 years behind the philosophy that is being engaged with. And so ultimately, creating a smarter society is not going to improve that. We need to create a society which is, I think, by and large, respective of individuals, not simply and expressing the conclusions of ethics, not simply more intelligent.
Sure. So I guess what I'm trying to suggest is this very much sounds like the same approach that I would have these sorts of issues. So simply saying that, hey, you could justify a certain type of eugenics under your system doesn't seem to be a very persuasive argument against other systems if it also applies to your own system.
But my system doesn't, like, for example, your system would justify trespassing upon another's subjectivity as not being wrong, because the only thing that's being perpetuated is knowledge. My system would say that is intrinsically wrong and so unethical. It would dismiss the very conclusions of ethics in the first place. So my system wouldn't allow for that. Your system would.
So I'm trying to ask, are you okay with coercing people in general? Because that is trespassing on subjectivity.
Like, one, I don't believe, I think that one, we need to move towards socialism for the very reason that I don't believe in economic coercion. I think, you would probably agree.
Sure. Under socialism, there would be economic coercion, right?
Well,
unless you think that everyone have every access to every resource at all the time and there'd be no limitations, right?
No, I mean, like, I'm not saying that we're in a state of like no scarcity, but what I'm saying is that when it comes to coercion through needs, I would say, like, then it will relate to needs and wants. And if we say that, like, look, we can incentivize and coerce through incentivization, like a positive way, a good outcome, I don't have a problem with that. I don't think there's anything unethical about that.
Why would positive coercion? So, like, taxation is a negative coercion. And so to me, it seems very easy to justify that. And so you don't like negative coercion in eugenics, but apparently it seems like you're okay with negative coercion with taxation, I would assume.
I'm okay with taxation because I don't see it as negative. I see it as positive in relation to maintaining society and the function of the market, which people are dependent upon. I would take probably Robert Nozick's argument in the principle of compensation.
You're restricting someone's freedom. You're restricting someone's freedom in like for the individual, right?
Well,
from the individual perspective,
I would actually
moral theories here, right?
Well, actually, I would say you're expressing that freedom. So, like, this is why I asked you what freedom was, because you took a negative position in relation to freedom. Right? You related. Was it negative freedom or positive freedom? So I'd say negative freedom's Sartre. Yeah. So, like, negative freedom's Sartre usually, like, to be uncaused. An agent is free if they are not being caused by anything else. So if they are the foundation of their desire, they choose to act in such a way. Then there's positive freedom, to be unrestricted. An agent is free if they get what they want in relation to that desire. I think both sides are wrong, or at least half right. I think that what freedom is a combination of negative and positive freedom. An individual is free when they want what they want and they get it. So in other words, like they want something that is rational and they can show the reasons behind it, and so are the cause of their desire in relation to their system of drives, and then they actually are able to achieve that desire. Now, so what I would say in relation to law...
That they're irrational.
What?
Just to cut you off, it sounds like you're saying that only rational desires count as freedom.
Yeah.
Okay, but... Okay, it's just like this sounds absurd. Like that, then the definition of freedom is not relevant to the individual. It's how society defines freedom. So then, if society takes away reproductive freedom from your definition of freedom, by your logic, eugenics, like stopping people from breeding, would no longer be coercion.
No, I think that like if you were to say this, like if you were to say like there was a law. If there was a law that was rationally deducible that it would be good to do something like, or not good, like for example, there's a law that you should wear face masks. There's a law that you are not allowed to travel. I would say that ultimately in a normal society that was functioning, these would be unjustified restrictions placed on a government which prevent people from acting freely. But in a case of a global pandemic, it shows that it is rational because it is good for the society and the individuals that exist within it who are being considered. It is rational and justified, and so when an individual follows the law, they are expressing freedom and not dismissing it. They're at home with the reasons and they're at home with the reasons. That
in America, okay, I live in a country where half of us voted for fucking Trump. Okay, people are not at home with like respecting mask mandates.
Oh yeah,
people
but America, like just because people are.
People don't follow the law just because they've like come to peace with the law. They follow the law because there's force on the other end of it.
Oh, I agree. Like there is irrational power dynamics which coerce our systems, and I think this was Marx's critique of Hegel. I have no problem with saying that there's cultural hegemony and that individuals are coerced into conclusions that have nothing to do with actually being ethically justified. Now, I can show that being wrong in relation to ethics. Now, that would be the foundation of what I go, that the removal of these power structures ultimately undermines what ethics is trying to do, which is express the greatest overall freedom of the populace. And so what we need to do is remove unjustified power structures, which is why I'm a libertarian socialist.
Okay, so I guess the fundamental question then is, it seems like you are trying to say that you aren't willing to like coerce people to certain laws, but it seems like there's like enormous amounts of evidence that like coercion can in fact make people happier. Like the simplest example would be like sugar taxes. Increasing the cost it takes to buy certain types of foods literally makes people less obese, which in turn helps them both like in terms of health and mental well-being. So it seems like certain restrictions on actions can literally benefit people. But if you're unwilling to do these sorts of things because you're going to call them like a cultural hegemony sort of things, then to me, it seems like you're actually reducing freedom. Now you might say, well, these laws are okay because actually people would rationally come to the conclusion that they wouldn't want to drink that sugar. So now it's not actually coercion.
Yeah.
But it sounds like you're deriving the same conclusion via a more complicated methodology. And this would just lead us back to the same conclusion.
No.
Both supporting eugenics, apparently.
No. Like I don't think either of us support eugenics, and I know that. But like what I'm saying is that like one, I'll still maintain my system does not lead to eugenics. And two, and especially in a negative sense. And two, I would say that ultimately the separation of coercion by a justified authority and an unjustified authority implies a power dynamic in which the individual is actually being considered and not a top-down understanding of ethics, which an asserted good is placed upon an agent by an authority. This would be the separation from a government who acts in the interests of a bourgeois capitalist class rather than the interests of a public when it produces its laws. When a government produces laws which are justifiable in relation to the populace, we would say those laws are good. When we see a capitalist class that produces the laws which are imposed upon the people, we would say that is bad, that the coercion is non-justified, that there is sometimes that authority is justified and sometimes it's not. And that's why I would ground my ethics in relation to subjectivity and the expression of the individual rather than some sort of abstract right presupposed by proposed technocrats.
Sure. So all you're really saying to me seems to be the truism that literally every ideology agrees, which is that we oppose unjustified hierarchies. Theocrats think that God appointed their man in charge. They think it's justified because that's what led to that. And if your critique of a system is that using a certain system can lead to justification of bad outcomes, then the idea that justified authority is sufficient can justify those outcomes. So this is the reason I don't reject the idea that we should reject unjustified hierarchy. I'm rejecting the idea that you should critique a system because it can be used to justify justify bad systems. You should, because the reason that we reject theocracy is not because we reject that they're using the logic of unjustified hierarchies. We critique it because we think theocracy is not justified. We critique eugenics not because we critique the morality underlying it. We critique it because we think the reasons for it are unjustified. Like we're critiquing them on the factual grounds, not necessarily on the moral grounds.
See, I disagree. I think that we critique them both on the moral and the factual grounds. Like, it just so happens that eugenics doesn't work, but even if eugenics did work, it wouldn't be justified. It's like, even if like capitalism is better in producing, greater outcomes for the lowest group of individuals in terms of pure material benefit, which I don't think it does, it wouldn't justify the exploitation of those individuals to give them, a manner of life which they may feel is materially better. Ultimately, what we are considering is what is valuable to the individuals themselves, and that could be that creative process, the psychology, and ultimately their ability to express happiness in their lives, which may be impeded by purely materialism being considered. And I think that I would reject any sort of non-moralism in relation to socialism. And I think that many socialists who disagree with some certain foundations, like ethical foundations like equality and epistemological foundations in relation to knowledge, which I would argue were, I think Rem did a really good job at showing Vosch up for this, ultimately lead themselves to a conclusion in which socialism is no more justified than something like fascism, and on a hypothetical basis in relation to any given end. Now, what I would say is ultimately, like, in relation to the system that you presuppose versus the system that I would not presuppose but ground, and arguably you can say that grounded, it's not grounded, and I will accept that you can make that argument. But ultimately, what I would say is that yours presupposes a given end which is just as justified as any other presupposition, and so you're acting hegemonically in relation in relation to trying to maximize the outcome of a given system. It's essentially a cult or a prescriptive ethic engaged en masse. If it does function, it's only in relation to the socio-culturally relative position that you're in. The same thing as a Nazi, the same thing as a Jainist or any other religion. That's all it is. And so ultimately, I don't see any other. Not only is it ungrounded, but it's ultimately no more grounded than any other ungrounded position. And so when we even talk about hypothetical conclusions and pragmatics in relation to society, they're all judged against the notion of good and bad in the first place. Like, we judge the efficiency of a society as good or bad in relation to the outcomes for those individuals. It's like when capitalists talk about but look at all these wealthy nations, which one's the best country? It's the one that's the richest. Well, no, actually, I wouldn't say the best country is the one that's the richest. The best country is the one which has the greatest overall happy population, which is why I would say Scandinavia is a better country, has better countries in it than many other European and America or something like that, many other capitalist countries, because the overall conditions for the individuals is of a greater degree that expresses something which is valuable. Now, what isn't valuable is some sort of abstract goal of profit, but what is valuable is actually the experience of value to agents, which cannot be denied. And I would say that you cannot doubt these things. And so ultimately, at least I can say there is an irreducible value to my moral system. But with yours, it's so abstract, it can justify anything. And even if it doesn't, it's just as justifiable as any other abstract moral theory.
All right. So on that note, of arriving at an irreducible moral justification for your theory, since we've hit the 2 hour and 5 minutes mark, I figured it might be a good point to close off a bit.
Yeah, that's fine.
So why don't I give you a closing statement then? If you had to, so why don't I can do two things. One would be the short one. If you had to try and summarize your moral claim and then how it relates to veganism in 3 sentences, preferably simple-ish sentences, how would you summarize it? And I understand that deontology is not so simple, but
okay. Okay. So we cannot help but seek what is valuable, and what is valuable is understood objectively we cannot help but seek what is valuable. What is valuable must be understood objectively of any given agent. The individual yeah, okay, wait a minute. We cannot
You,
help but seek. I'll start again. So, like, we cannot help but seek the greatest value in our experiences. The greatest value of our experiences can only be understood in relation to a common and objective domain. We engage, therefore, in an uncommon and objective domain which metaphysically seeks to understand value, free of any, like, caprice or presupposed value, which exists in all agents, in order to remove our subjective bias. So we seek that which is so we seek value, and we do so. We try. Sorry, yeah. So we seek that which is valuable in the greatest degree possible. The greatest degree possible removes subjective bias. An objective ethical framework, which includes sentient beings, removes bias in relation to value to the greatest overall possible degree, and therefore we should engage in it. I hope that explains it in the best way I can, like in 3 sentences.
I just wanted a short explanation for people who came in right at the end. So, thank you for that. Thank you for the little debate. I know it was long and probably got a little heated towards the end. I hope it was reasonably respectful. Let's see. Standard thing. Do you want to tell us who you are, what you do, and where people can find you?
Yeah, so once again, my name is Perspective Philosophy. I'm a PhD student studying philosophy, and I'm writing a thesis entitled essentially A Dialectical Defense of Animal Liberation, in which I argue that animals are valuable in and of themselves, and that we must value them in order to engage in ethics in a meaningful way. You can check me out on my channel, Perspective Philosophy, which is in the description. And would you like to do the same for my channel?
Sure. I'm still Aiden. I still run the channel Socialism Done Left. I guess I do debates and debunks of stuff mostly related to politics. I have clearly not read as much into philosophy as my friend over here has, but I have read a lot more into empirics. And so if you'd like more of an empirical justification for leftist politics rather than an ethical one, I am sure you will probably find it within either my videos or the stinky right-winger fact sheet, which has a whole bunch of studies on that topic. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's links in the description as well, in case anyone's interested from my audience. Just go over there, show some love, subscribe, do all that good stuff. So yeah, like, I do appreciate the conversation. I know it did get heated as well. And yeah, like, at the end of the day, I just think that I will implore anyone who's watching this to reject what I would say is an unjustified bias towards humans. At the end of the day, I would say that, like, we should reject speciesism the same way as we should reject racism, sexism, and other forms of prejudice. So yeah, care about equality.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I hope you have a lovely rest of the day.
Yeah, you too, man. Take it easy.
Jessica says now kiss.
Take it easy, man.
You too.
Bye. Right. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation, guys. If you'd like to, please give it a thumbs up. Obviously, go show some love on to Aiden's stream. So for the next 5 minutes or so, I'll take some quick questions, and then I'm gonna bounce. So yeah, has anyone got any questions in relation to today's conversation, or philosophy and ethics as a whole? If you do, drop it into chat. How do I think that debate went? Thank you, Tomorrow, for your question. Well, it went okay. I don't know if I hope I instantiated me claim well enough. And yeah, I think that if anyone else is interested in understanding an objective moral system, just check out my video on it, which is Objective Ethics Explained. Why, like, was it Objective Ethics Explained? Or why morality exists even if there is no God. So yeah, check that out. I think that ultimately, like, his intelligence hierarchy in a whole, like, I think it's a bit misguided. I think that he's ultimately valuing intelligence in relation to morality, and so morality becomes this presupposed end goal, which is good in and of itself. And so in reality, the only thing that matters is intelligence for him. and that I think I showed that. I'd like to hope I showed that anyway. What do you say to someone who says you can't measure ethics and therefore it's not objective? Lol. Okay, so what's objective isn't necessarily what's empirical. You can make rational arguments which are true by definition, and they be objective. It is true that 1 + 1 = 2, regardless of you having like a rock or two rocks in front of you or any abstract measure of that logical reality. So what I would say is that you can have logical proofs and you can have empirical proofs. Ethics can rely upon logical as well as empirical evidence. And how lovely. I would say that anyone that ultimately, I think that it's nonsense to say that people with disabilities matter less. I think that's actually really disgusting. So yeah. Do you agree in right to swing one's fist as far as another's nose? Complete freedom excluding intruding upon another's freedom? No. I believe that we can have rational restrictions to freedom and that the individual will find themselves in reason and expression of their freedom in reason, which is why I engaged in ethics to say that restrictions are justified in the first place. What Aidan can't do is say why restrictions are good, because ultimately he can't make any claim about good. The only thing that he could say is that restrictions are good in relation to maximizing intelligence and moral like philosophy, in which case he'd be better in saying like, look, we need to maybe stop people engaging in science and force them to engage in something like in something like ethics. And so we just need everyone to be doing ethics round the clock as much as possible. Create a philosopher class. I think he by and large, I was trying to show this, ends up being something akin to having a Platonic society, which is based around the perpetuation of reason and the philosopher class. So yeah, thank you for your question. I think ultimately it's sad to see left-wing people make such terrible epistemological claims. Really bad, like really special pleading morality as well. And he didn't give an argument to say why he thought morality wasn't grounded. He just said, look, like, I don't think it is, which is what I wanted to pull him up for next, but like obviously time restraints. Do I know of any philosophical theories that state literally everything has moral value? No. And I would say that would be just moral nihilism, in the sense that like if everything has moral value or like equal moral value, then everything has the same like it's kind of like there is no separation between value. Then like if everything is valuable in the same sense, in the same outcome, then it's ultimately and all actions matter exactly the same, then nothing matters. I didn't hear Xander Hall. I wanted to debate Xander Hall as well. I reached out to him. Getting leftists to debate on veganism is almost as hard as getting rightists to debate, righties to debate on socialism. I haven't seen Russell Brand's new video, primarily focused on vegan activism and the vegan teacher. No, I'll definitely give that a look. How can you justify this restricting freedom from protecting another's freedom? Because I'd say that understanding freedom in relation to our expression of it requires an understanding of freedom itself, and freedom itself is engaged in all agents. It's like, it is the experience of all agents. And so restricting freedom to prevent a greater trespass upon another's freedom maximizes the expression of freedom, which is why laws actually allow us to live in a society which express freedom to a greater degree, and we rationally agree with those laws, like do not kill, because it allows for the greatest expression of freedom, including our own. I'd say even an understanding of what freedom is, what desires are, what is justified, ultimately in the end of the day, relies upon universals. And so if we try to presuppose an individual's subjective preferences as an end, then we are in a one-sided master-slave dynamic, rather than actually agreeing upon rationally evidenced conclusions in ethics. So yeah, thank you for your question. You read, have I read Kierkegaard? Yes. It's really good. Probably one of my favorite existentialists. Xander Hall is okay. I don't know about Xander Hall. I don't think that it's necessarily the case for that everyone has moral value. You can still consider telos of an entity. Nihilism denies telos completely. Well, what I'm saying is that to understand your individual telos, like you can presuppose one and then work up as you find out that like there are logical barriers in you presupposing a given end. And then that's what I would say had happened. Like, look, like, you know, ethics started from people presupposing given ends in relation to what Hegel called the heroic morality, in which someone basically went, look, this is what's right and wrong, live with it, right? And he saw it as not a bad thing because it led to morality. But when morality and ethics become engaged, then we rationally deduce what is true or not in relation to ethics and morality, and what is good and bad, and those words only have meaning when applied to like a universal. They only have meaning applied when they have a metaphysical instantiation which is common to all agents. And so if we say like, look, this is true, like what is good for white people is what is good, I would say that, look, like not only like the evidence of it not being true is in the dismissal and rejection of that judgment in black people and in their experience of value, from which the metaphysical evaluation of reality is present. And so when I say like what is valuable and my understanding of that, if I just start rejecting what black people find valuable, then I'm doing so on an unjustified basis, which is why it's racism. It's prejudice. There is no reason to do that. And so ultimately, we shouldn't be racist, even for ourselves. It is irrational. Oh, how can you justify restricting aside from protecting another's freedom? Oh, right, I get you, stupid vegan. I misread that. Um, it would literally be the engagement in reasons. So you could restrict in protecting their own freedom. Like you could do it and go like, look, we're not going to let you kill yourself, or we're not going to let you take these drugs and harm yourself in relation to the expression of your freedom and your subjectivity. I haven't read Coast Guard. I actually keep meaning to read Coast Guard, and she even has a book on animal liberation, which I definitely need to check out. I'm naughty for not reading Coast Guard. So yeah, so I'm gonna go off now, guys. I hope you've all enjoyed this debate. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Remember to subscribe and hit that bell if you want to see more content like this one. And thank you to the patrons on Patreon, especially Ethan Pollitt, for donating to make these streams possible. If you're interested in becoming a patron, please check out the description below and follow the link to Patreon. I hope you all have a lovely day. Thank you very much. And remember, and as always, try to gain some perspective.